Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to that Christian Nerd channel. And so today's live stream is pretty much going to be a sequel to yesterday's live stream. If you don't know, I have a class called Ministry After Postmodernity, in which we talk about how to do Christian ministry after the postmodern. If you don't know what postmodernism is and that sort of thing, what happened during that era, you might say, then check out the previous live stream. But the class is named after postmodernity, right? And so it's a recognition that we're in something different now, and we're trying to figure out what that is. And this term, metamodern, is a term that's been used for that. And so in today's stream, we're going to talk about what's going on currently, what's this era, what are we talking about, and how could we potentially be Christian in this era. And so joining me for this, who actually was in, I believe, two of my class periods to speak to the classroom, is a metamodern thought leader, you might say, potentially. Brendan Graham Dempsey. How you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So, give us a quick introduction to you and why, and your journey, and why this topic is important to you, both of metamodernism and an interest in a metamodern Christianity.
Sure. And also, just to say thanks for this opportunity. This is fun and exciting and interesting. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk in those classes that you mentioned. Appreciated the invitation of Dr. Matt Leverin to come and explore this topic of Christianity after postmodernism. I guess he found some of my work, and so that is particularly one of the major areas, I guess you could say, in which I'm focusing my attention, but metamodernism more broadly. So anyway, just to say thanks for all this, and this is an interesting and opportunity and a fun one. Yeah, in terms of trying to set this up, which aspects would you like me to hit on first? Was it just sort of setting up what metamodernism is and how a metamodern Christianity might be formulated, or what would you like to?
Perhaps your journey into why this
Ah,
is an interesting topic for you. Yeah,
sure.
how it
Yeah,
relates
well,
to your journey.
yeah. I started out in biblical studies myself. I double majored in classical civilizations and religious studies in my undergrad. Originally had a conception of becoming a pastor at one point, but I decided that I was better suited for some kind of academic context, maybe teaching Christian history or biblical studies at a seminary. Grew up in a very kind of religious family, so that's what's kind of started me out on that track. So I got really deep into that, and learned the Greek and the Hebrew and all that stuff to do the New Testament work, and I got really interested in biblical studies and kind of the compositional history and all that jazz. But in the process of doing that, it kind of created some tensions, to put it mildly, between what I was finding in the sort of biblical academic literature versus what I'd been sort of raised into as certain conceptions around who wrote the Bible and when was it written, and notions of inspiration and reliability and those sorts of things. As I kind of got deeper and deeper into the material, it seemed a lot harder for me to kind of square my more kind of conservative evangelical framings of that with what I was studying in the material. And so that kind of precipitated a crisis, and didn't know exactly what that would look like in terms of how that would pan out, because my whole orienting career framework and everything, all of my kind of life trajectory was oriented in a particular direction that then got kind of disrupted and upended. Suffice to say, I didn't wind up going on to pursue a career path, teaching at a seminary. Instead, wound up living 4 years in an artist collective, reading a lot, writing a lot, trying to process issues of faith and meaning, and ultimately God as something that can undergo transformations and evolutions and developments in thought, which is what I was experiencing. And so started to develop a kind of framework that could make sense of that for me, and returned to the kind of field of religious studies to do a master's at Yale Divinity School, where I focused on religion and the arts. That was very interesting, and I could say a lot about that. But subsequently, my focus has sort of been on the nexus between culture and religion, and specifically as you know, metamodernism, which we can talk about in a second. And so that's kind of my way into this, is sort of my faith journey, kind of leading me through various kinds of existential crises and crises of faith, crises of meaning making, that got me interested in meaning making itself, and how notions of religion, spirituality, God, and Christianity themselves be up for sort of developmental renegotiation or reconceptualization, transformation. And so that's kind of a lot of what I study now.
Gotcha. So you mentioned it, we mentioned it already. My understanding of things is that there have been different historical periods throughout history. You could think the medieval era, Enlightenment era, all these different things, and we had a modern era, and then we had a postmodern era, which we talked about in the last live stream. But now we're in something else. So help us understand and introduce us to that something else.
Sure. Yeah, people call it metamodernism or even metamodernity. It's a way of talking about this moment that we're in, which seems markedly different than the postmodern moment and the modern moment. And it's also a bit more than that. It's not just necessarily for talking about historical epochs or zeitgeist or anything like that. It really has to also do with working through the intellectual heritage of postmodernism, as sort of a paradigm of thought. So metamodernism is can broadly be kind of conceived as what comes on the other side of postmodernism. Again, whether you conceive of that as sort of a period or a kind of paradigm, what have you, there are different ways of thinking about it. But super briefly, postmodernism was itself kind of a reaction to modernity or modernism, or the modern. Um, and by that, it sort of critiqued a lot of notions that were very core to the modern sensibility and the modern paradigm. So the modern was sort of characteristically defined by a belief in progress, using technology and various kinds of political developments to move things forward, to expand freedom, to improve the quality of life, etc. And so the advancements in medicine and again all the technologies that have come online, at an increasing rate, have sort of fueled a certain worldview of thinking in terms of kind of upward progress, which itself was sort of contrasting itself relative to the pre-modern, which was much more about either static kind of continuity over time or cyclical ways of thinking, more rooted in authority and tradition and things like that. And the modern was sort of like, no, we're changing things and we're innovating and we're updating and everything's going to be different. There was a kind of revolutionary flair to it. And a lot of the revolutions of the modern period were inspired by this ethos, and various kinds of utopian projects and all this sort of thing. And in the 20th century, a lot of that got critiqued for various historical reasons, intellectual reasons, philosophical reasons. But this was like the postmodern move away from the modern, which was basically drawing out a lot of the failures of the modern project and notions of enlightenment, reason, and progress, and all this. And it did that in multiple ways, but it came to constitute a sort of new way of seeing the world, a new worldview, a new paradigm. It became very kind of central in academic institutions, especially in the latter 20th century. And a lot of it had to do with critique and skepticism, cynicism, kind of taking up the ideals and idealism of modernity and critiquing them, or laying them bare to problematization, saying, oh, well, look at all the terrible things that modernity also generated, imperialism, colonialism, the implicit kinds of maybe sexism or other kinds of isms that propagate in certain ways of seeing the world. And also doing a number of sort of hermeneutic moves that sort of just disrupted texts and deconstructed texts and kind of called meaning of various kinds into doubt. And so a lot of postmodernism was sort of characterized by that, and as a kind of intellectual program, but also as a sensibility. As a consequence, it was very characterized by a kind of cynicism and a skepticism, maybe even a kind of apathy, if one thinks back to sort of the 80s and 90s. There's this kind of late modern malaise, and this sort of hyper commodification of everything, and a sort of loss of idealism in the sense that maybe everything was a joke. And the rise of a certain kind of pop culture that kind of played into these kinds of tropes. You could think of The Simpsons or South Park, Family Guy, all these things that kind of critiqued and offered as a send up all those things that used to be more earnestly presented in sort of modern entertainment. So Leave It to Beaver becomes The Simpsons sort of a thing. So anyway, that's kind of postmodernism in a nutshell. And that's been sort of the cultural dominant mode for some decades. But that starts to change at the turn of the millennium, when some cultural theorists are looking around and they're seeing a lot of art and stuff that like doesn't really conform to that old paradigm anymore. They're seeing things like Sufjan Stevens and certain kinds of emo music and Wes Anderson movies, and the whole kind of genre of artworks across different media that seem to have some kind of a new sincerity about them, which is very different from sort of the postmodern cynicism. So initially, this got kind of identified in terms of a kind of cultural sensibility. Um, and it was a sense of, hey, there seems to be a return going on, like a return to earnestness and sincerity, to an interest in meaning, and sort of maybe history, and having a sense of identity in deep kind of mythic frameworks, things like this. But what rendered it different from sort of modern stuff that had those characteristics too was that it was also always shot through with its own kind of self-reflective awareness, right? Like Wes Anderson movies, there's a lot of sincerity and earnestness, but there's the pretext of a kind of knowingness that that's what it's doing. It's sort of intentionally sincere, or exhibits a kind of ironic sincerity, which is what the cultural studies folks who first described this described it as. So anyway, so this kind of this cultural shift in sensibility and vibe, new stuff showing up in the arts. And over the past 10 years, this has deepened and crystallized into a more kind of holistic, comprehensive paradigm. Now, people engaging this metamodern framework are operating also in fields of kind of critical theory. So Jason Storm's work is a systematic philosophy operating under the banner of metamodernism, but doing a rather different but related project. You've got political folks doing new things under the banner of metamodernism. And you've got different ways of conceptualizing these sorts of things, but all kind of turning to this sort of a rubric of something that's come after postmodernism, that's moved back towards a sense of earnestness and sincerity, but also has a kind of hyper reflexive, aware move going on, and in some ways has sort of negated the negation that was postmodernism, right? If postmodernism was the anti to the modern pro, then the anti has met its own anti. But when you kind of do a double negative, you kind of create something positive. That'd be one way of thinking about some of the stuff that's going on. So yeah, metamodernism at this point is sort of a kind of comprehensive term for a number of different but also related strands of discourse that are all trying to do something kind of progressively postmodern, that's showing up after postmodernism and beyond postmodernism, and yet also kind of by means of postmodernism. It's kind of taken in some of the key aspects of what the postmodern offered, but then doing new things with them, maybe radicalizing them, maybe subverting them, doing all sorts of things that ultimately leads to a very different sensibility and a whole kind of different approach to knowledge and this sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the things I actually appreciated when I was looking into the metamodern stuff for class. Is that number of times, talking about say the Bible or something like that, you get this sense that people are like, "Oh, that's just that dumb old book," and like there is that like everything is a joke. All these the old stuff is just a bunch of like joke stuff, but and that feels postmodern. But what metamodernism wants to do is say, no, this is relevant.
Mm,
Everything that came before us is necessarily relevant. We can
mm,
push past it, we can critique it, we can drop some things, but it all matters. And so I feel like there's a sense of humility as well, and more earnestness in that approach.
mm,
But it's also metamodernism has also been described as like fundamentally a oscillation or a toggling back and forth between the irony and the sincerity. And at least in my understanding, I think that has shown up in actually one of my favorite comedy shows. I don't know if anyone or if you have seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, it's a really funny show, but like, and so they joke around a lot, but there's a number of episodes where they do treat certain subject matters very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Like racism is like one of the things. Like Captain Holt, he's like an awesome character in the show, and he's gay and black, and he talks about how he's had to fight all these years to become a captain because when he was around, like, you know, someone being homophobic but not racist was like awesome back when he was a officer, you know. And so yeah, it treats those things with sincerity, but it
Mm-hmm.
also doesn't shy away from making jokes, and the jokes too seem respectful even as well, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I would also just on that front, like there's a lot of examples that you could give, but like BoJack Horseman, I think is a show that does something similar. It's like very serious, but it's also this crazy animated,
Mm,
comedy show. Rick and Morty, another example where you've got these like really deep existential themes about meaning and all this stuff, or nihilism, which is both ridiculous but also really heartfelt at these really unexpected moments. So yeah, I think that that's very characteristic of metamodern art, is being able to like do that move simultaneously, where something can be treated very earnestly and seriously, either simultaneous with or immediately contrasted with some kind of irony or some kind of joking, self-aware kind of move happening. So yeah, yeah, definitely.
cool, cool. And so, we talked about metamodern art. We also talked about postmodern art in the last live stream. That was that was a doozy, I'll tell you what. But uh, you have conceptualized a metamodern Christianity. And so what you're describing now and like integrating that into like a Christian frame, this like oscillation between like the irony and the sincerity doesn't sound too bad. However, at least I know because I was in class and I watched the content, that there's a lot more going on. And so help us understand your framing of like a meta modern Christianity and then how that differs from say um, what me and Kevin talked about in the last live stream with like a postmodern Christianity.
Sure. Yeah. So, like metamodernism broadly, there are a couple of different strands to it and different ways of going about talking about, conceptualizing some of the core aspects here. And so, different people are approaching this topic in different sorts of ways, drawing on different aspects of the metamodern paradigm. Paul Antleitner, for example, does a lot of work talking about metamodern Christianity, but he tends to focus a lot more on this kind of irony, sincerity, cultural studies kind of framing of art and the sensibility and everything. And that's all great. That's just as a slightly different focus. The way that I'm kind of coming at it is by drawing more on the fact of this idea of meta, right, which is a kind of recursive reflection that goes on. If you want to do metacognition, then you're thinking about thinking, or if you want to talk about meta language, then there's some kind of language about language. And so there seems to be, in my estimation, in my analysis of the kind of metamodern discourse space, a similar move going on across these different strands. And I think you can kind of capture that in terms of this meta move, which is a kind of increasing level of reflection, so that something is kind of taking itself as an object of reflection and then sort of baking that into its own understanding of the world. And as you kind of move back, you're able to reflect on more and more things. And so you're able to kind of get a increasing scope or vantage on things. And so that's kind of the way I'm talking about this. And there are ways in which, Storm's work is doing this, and the cultural studies stuff talks about this. And I made a video, if people are interested, where I analyze a clip from Bo Burnham's Inside, which is sort of a classically metamodern art piece in terms of this particular move. And why that's kind of relevant is because the whole thing we were talking about a second ago, in terms of the pre-modern leading to the modern, leading to the postmodern, leading to the metamodern, can actually itself be understood in this way, where the modern perspective or vantage shows up by means of being able to reflect on the pre-modern and drawing some distinction there, and then saying, oh well, we're not like that and we are like this, and doing some kind of a reflective distancing, which can give it some kind of higher vantage in kind of remove it from what had been sort of an embedded kind of perspective. And then the postmodern kind of does that to the modern. It's like, hey, but actually this modern move, you're still missing a bunch. You're missing out on what's on the margins, and you're blind to the way that the system and social structures are informing or prejudicing you in certain directions. And so that kind of deconstructive move and the kind of focus on systems of knowledge, all of that thing that postmodernism does is itself a kind of reflection on the modern. And similarly, this metamodern thing seems to be a reflection on the postmodern, but also it's like seeing that this reflecting pattern has its own kind of pattern to it, right? So that now the metamodern's also reflecting on the fact that there is a pre-modern that's leading to a modern that's leading to a postmodern. So it takes all of that into its ken, and it sees that kind of the very development of cultural sensibilities and paradigms is itself a kind of meta move that occurs. And so aspects of this are talked about in or emphasized more in other aspects of the discourse. It's really big in the work of Hansi Freinacht, who's a metamodern thinker, who he's drawing on like integral theory framings and ways of thinking about culture developmentally. But it's also in aspects of Jason Storm's work to some degree, in the sense that he's talking about Hegelian dialectics. Anyway, I won't get into all the details, and I hope that that's not ridiculously in the weeds and boring. But the point is that there's some kind of movement that can be identified here of going meta on something. And so what that means to me then is that we can understand some really important aspects of our experience and culture through a kind of developmental unfolding, right? That like one thing leads to the other, and then that is able to gain a new vantage on what had been, so that that leads to a new thing, and that there's a process here that you can call it dialectical progression or dialectical materialism or just developmental sociology. There are various ways of thinking about it, but that this is kind of a process that's in play. And so all that's by way of kind of setting up the context for what I talk about as a metamodern Christianity, which is trying to engage the Christian tradition from a vantage that includes all of these particular modalities or paradigms as meaningful and essential parts of a whole, meaning whatever the pre-modern Christianity that was happening looked like, whatever the modern Christianity that was happening looked like, whatever the postmodern Christianity happening, whatever that looked like, all of that can be understood as a kind of developmental sequence that has some important parallels to the way also that people progress through their own faith journey. And so a lot of my work on metamodern Christianity is trying to look at Christianity as itself a developmental process, and undergoing sort of transformation, complexification, and a kind of increasingly reflective remove that leads to greater levels of abstraction and ultimately sees that all as a kind of spiritual process. Gosh, that probably isn't very intelligible for anyone, phrasing it that way, which is why I've made so many videos about, trying to unpack some of this stuff. But yeah, feel
Right.
free to pick into that wherever you want, and I can try to explain it a little bit better.
Yeah, and so so you can clarify my understanding. So, my understanding of what you're saying is that there are reflections on Christianity from a meta-modern perspective that's looking at this going back and forth between the irony and the sincerity. But what you're doing is focusing on the term meta and how, like, say, thinking about thinking is meta, right? Metacognition, as you said. And so, what we're doing is applying that sort of reflective schema to Christianity and seeing its developmental stages over time and considering how we can continue to develop further and how we can continue to become more meta as time and thought continues. Would that be a short,
Yeah, that's
very
great.
short
And
synopsis of that? Yeah.
yeah, totally. And I mean, the way that I look at it is that people can differ with my interpretation of it, but I see a kind of deep structure to, again, this meta modern move. And I think it's in there when you think about even meta modern art, right? Jumping back to that Wes Anderson stuff, or maybe some of the television that you could bring up as examples. Um, Meta modern sincerity isn't naive kind of modern sincerity. It has a kind of informed, self-aware quality to it. So the self-reflective aspect of the postmodern is still being carried forward, even as that more modern earnestness is also being carried forward. So you get this sort of synthesis of something happening there, where it's not either modern sincerity or postmodern irony. It's something like both. But
Hmm.
yet, because it's both of them, it's also neither one of those. It's something different. It's its own thing. It's its own sensibility. So that kind of move is classic for sort of this dialectical thing, as you get this kind of thesis, antithesis, and then a new synthesis that's of a different sort. It'd be one way of talking about dialectics, kind of simplified version. But that this is something that's undergoing, that the culture is undergoing. And when you look at metamodernism in culture, but also in the philosophy and some of the other ways of theorizing it, it seems like what's happening is that aspects of the postmodern are being carried forward, but they're also not neglecting, the modern and the pre-modern as important constitutive aspects of that. So you get these returns, right? But they're qualified returns. Um, it's not like we're just jumping back to a pre-modern sensibility with these sorts of things or a modern sensibility. It's we're taking those things forward and we're kind of transforming them through the postmodern and increasing levels of reflection to get a kind of hyper reflected way of looking at the world. And that's where that kind of toggling idea comes in as well. Because you've got these different modes, different perspectives that you're able now to kind of cognize on their own terms. And you can say, oh, okay, well, I can be really earnest one second, but then I can be really ironic and reflective on that earnestness the other second and be like, but that could all be nonsense, and those kinds of moves generate this sort of third space, which is like, not really found in the other one. So, yeah, that's how I would kind of think about this all being one kind of structure. And when I think about that in terms of Christianity, then it's sort of like, all right, what are these kind of returns that you might be seeing that weren't possible under postmodern skepticism and cynicism and irony, but are showing up now? But also, how are they different from what would have been if you just weren't inflecting them through postmodernism? And then, just real quick, the last thing I want to say to that is this is actually really important because um, what needs to be very clearly distinguished from what I'm talking about is this other kind of move, which is also happening lots of the time in culture, where you see basically some kind of return to an older way of looking at something, but kind of in reaction to the world as it is in the modern and the postmodern, right? So,
Hmm.
for example, the religious milieu that I grew up in had a lot of characteristics of fundamentalism, which in kind of a Vermont context, which is where I live, which is a very kind of secular, non-religious place, a word like fundamentalism lands very pejoratively. It's kind of a negative take, but I understand that people might self-identify with that label and don't mean it that way at all. But in this sense, fundamentalism of a sort of like reactionary movement of going back to kind of an extreme literalism and an extreme sort of like non-metaphorical, more pre-modern style hermeneutic, like that kind of move would seem different than the one that I'm talking about, because there it's sort of a rejection of the postmodern and the modern. The fundamentalist context that I'm familiar with and grew up in largely framed modernity itself kind of as devilish, and kind of this satanic force almost, and all the more so by the time you get to postmodernism, which is just blows the
Right.
wheels off it. So rather than see modernity and postmodernity as these kind of satanic evils that we need to escape from and go back to like the pure way of doing religion, that's a kind of like more reactionary approach. What I'm talking about is something that goes through modernity and through post-modernity and actually sees vital aspects of insight in both of those modes or epochs, but still is able to come out on the other side of that and have something, maybe that also includes more pre-modernly flavored sorts of sensibilities as well.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So to an extent, right? Every at least like to me as a more conservative like biblical studies kind of person, everything you're saying like sounds fine. Like yeah, we need to update with the culture. Christianity should consider these cultural paradigms and take some good things from it. Kind of the thing that Jesus says when he talks about the separating the wheat from the chaff.
Mm.
Right. I very much see that tendency, I think, happening in a metamodern framework. And I think a Christian could probably do that. However, um, what you want to do, and perhaps what you consider wheat and chaff, uh, is very hot takes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in one of your articles that we need to take the genuine knowledge from these different cultural periods and paradigms and incorporate them into Christianity, and then sort of push past them in a way that's kind of meta, right? Because of the reflective aspect of all of this.
Mm,
So with you, that entails the modern periods dealing with science, which would include like evolution, the Big Bang. Like if you're going to be a metamodern Christian, you should probably accept those things. And then the other thing is the higher biblical criticism, the sort of documentary hypothesis, and those sorts of things. So starting where I personally might agree with you, um, help us with the sort of science and evolution side of this equation.
sure. So yeah, I mean, the scientific approach is really the product of modernity, meaning yes, you can go back and find various kind of Greek mechanical thinkers
Natural
employing some.
philosophy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was certainly elements of that in the past, but in terms of getting like a whole methodology and epistemology based on sort of hypothesis, forming, testing, evidence collection, and all that stuff, that really shows up, after the kind of medieval flowering and into the early Renaissance period with folks like Francis Bacon and Galileo, on into Newton and all that, and so. Um, so, what we think about as the revelations of a scientific universe are really the province of modernity. If you go back before, let's just say, 1400 or so, you're dealing with a very different cosmology, and some really crucial ways about answering questions of like, where did the world come from, and how do we know what we know, and all that sort of thing. And so I do think that, yes, I would say very much so, that if we're going to be approaching something from a metamodern vantage, then I would advocate very strongly for taking the genuine insights of modernity seriously, which include the last 500 years of ongoing scientific study and investigation. Now, one thing is, I'll just say a meaningful distinction. I mean, there's a scientific method, and then there's what some people might assume is like a scientific worldview. And what I mean by that is like you'll hear people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Brian Greene and Sean Carroll, whoever, like famous physicists will go out there and they'll talk about the world in terms of, is there a meaning to life? No, we all came from, chance, accident, all this stuff. And they'll make like actually metaphysical claims about things that isn't actually science. It's like what some scientists think is what the big picture is about. And so a lot of people wind up conflating science with the scientific method, which is something different, which is scientific method is about, developing a hypothesis about how something works, gathering data, seeing if there's a way of being able to model that data using certain, all that kind of thing, isolating variables, etc. And so the scientific method reveals certain things, but how we interpret that and situate that into a broader cosmology and worldview might differ. I think science in the methodological aspect is really, really important. And I do think that it presents us with information that does require an upgrade to our worldview. But I would differ from those folks that I just named in that I actually don't think that science necessarily says that the universe is meaningless or that life is meaningless or everything's a fluke chance or whatever. That's all kind of smuggled in philosophy being done that we have to be careful about, not assuming that that's what we mean by science. But something like the theory of evolution is a hypothesis that has been for which evidence has been acquired and modeled and analyzed, and overwhelmingly supports that hypothesis. And to the point where if we are weighing sort of paradigmatic approaches to questions of where did the world come from, and or let's just say, where does the complexity that we see around us on the planet Earth come from, I think that there are better, or I would say better or worse ways to answer that question in terms of accounting for the data that we have and that science has provided us. So in that sense, certain worldviews then do become problematized and ultimately untenable in a scientific frame. For example, right? Like, I mean, I did come from a context growing up in which I believe my grandfather, for example, thought that the world was 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
But then you wind up finding that there are problems with that, right? Once Lyell comes around in the 19th century and starts doing geology, he's like, "Hey, actually, this rock I'm holding in my hand is billions of years old," and utterly upending kind of our understanding about these things. And then, of course, you find fossils and this sort of a thing, and so on and so forth. That eventually, it becomes so much more difficult to try to maintain some older hypothesis in light of all of the evidence, that the best thing to do is shift your paradigm to try to more holistically account for that evidence. And I think evolution is a classic example of that, and other kinds of insights from cosmology. So that I would say, yes, if you're alive today in 2024, I think the best, most informed approach to cosmology is to claim or to believe or to posit that the universe is around 14 billion years old, that the planet is around 4.5 billion years old, that life has been on this planet for around 3.5 billion years, if not more, and that human beings have been around here for, depending on where you want to draw that line, anywhere from 70,000 to 300,000, to how far you want to go back into the kind of evolutionary tree there. And I think that any framework that would deny that is going to be, I think, rightfully not given the same level of credibility compared to other perspectives. So I am very fine with that, and I think that once we actually allow for those worldview shifts to occur and our paradigm to shift, we can see that actually it opens up a new way of understanding the world that can still allow for meaning and purpose and value and the divine and the sacred and God and all these things. And in fact, actually, I would say profoundly enriches all of that. So I'll pause there, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I know that there were, when that geology started coming out about the age of the Earth, I know a lot of Christians were actually very accepting of it early on. I don't know if it was the majority, but there was a lot of them, and I know. Charles Spurgeon, for example, will like teach on Genesis 1, and he'll be like, "Yeah, the Earth could be millions of years old," and he'll just move on. Like he,
Mm.
bro, does not see any danger with that. And there's something to be said about Christians being so involved in like scientific revolution and helping progress science, because this is God's world, right? Was sort of the idea. Um, a lot of Christians did accept evolution early on, helped promulgate evolution. I myself, and you know this because I talked about it in class with you, but I myself am a theistic evolutionist. I did an interview with someone who wrote their doctoral dissertation on evolution and a kind of teleological understanding of evolution from a Christian perspective, and so that was interesting to talk about. But so I think at least this part of the modern frame, a lot of Christians could be on board with. And so, with that quick background in mind, do you have any thoughts on theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism that you've seen sort of in Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on this briefly in class, but I'm respectful of people who want to take a more intelligent design route and this sort of a thing. I personally do not go there, and I don't think I think it creates a lot more problems than we really even imagine. Um, even Yeah, go
So,
on.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but so, well, because we kind of talked about this too, but like you're obviously a very spiritual person. Presumably, you are a theist, right? And then you would also hold to evolution being true. And
Mm,
so, like, I guess if you were to be a Christian theistic evolutionist, you have to do a bit more. But at least in that base, you would,
I see, I
because
see. Yeah,
yeah,
no,
you
I
see
think
what I
that, yeah.
mean?
Yeah, so your category is broader than I was interpreting it. So, yes, I
Yeah,
think, there are ways to be a theistic evolutionist, certainly, and that could be a very broad category encompassing anything from intelligent design
right.
to, yeah, I mean, to take my case as an example, I find theism in terms of talking about a God concept, that's important to me. So I can, let's just say for the sake of this, I can identify as a theist in that sense. But I also believe in evolution, or posit evolution as being the best explanatory account of this matter. And so, but for me, it's very important that all of this is thoroughly, entirely naturalistic in the way it unfolds.
Mm,
And so,
interesting.
yeah, I think that that's really a really important part again for me.
Hmm.
In my understanding of this, because one of the crucial aspects that occurs in the shift to the modern frame is that you get a profound problematization of a kind of two worlds mythology, right? In the pre-modern context, it was very normal to think, oh, we live on we live in the world, but there's a supernatural sort of world. Um,
Yeah.
and it wouldn't have necessarily been used. That term wouldn't have been used, but it would have essentially been framed in that way. That sort of that
Hmm.
there's a realm, more or less up there, that is full of angels and God and whatnot, and that's sort of the superlunary world where everything is perfect and whatnot. And you get this whole kind of Ptolemaic cosmology, and if you read Dante, it's all in there and all that stuff. But what happens with modernity is that like that whole edifice crumbles. And yes, Christian scientists were the ones who basically increasingly found that to be the case. So, when the cosmologists or the astronomers rather went looking to understand the orbits of things and whatnot, in one by one, these certain kind of aspects of the kind of Ptolemaic geocentric universe just fell apart, whether it was circular orbits to, obviously geocentrism to heliocentrism. And then with Newton, you get basically the establishment of mechanical and mathematically articulable laws of motion that apply here on Earth, but also to the moon and what's above the moon, all the wandering planets and the planets. So that was this kind of breakthrough revolution where um, clearly what happens here is governed by the same laws as what happens up there, which was a total break from the pre-modern cosmos that had existed. And one could go on, right? But the point is that like that whole notion of like something up there being the divine and this being the kind of natural world, that all falls apart. That there seems to be just this one world. And as that has become clearer and clearer, you're faced with a much more and more kind of naturalistic frame in which whatever we're going to make sense of in terms of the divine, in terms of God, in terms of the theos of theism, that has to somehow be concluded in terms of a kind of endo-naturalistic framework. And just for the record, I wrote a book called Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence, which is really all about this, which is my conception of metamodern transcendence is not a two worlds transcendence to the immanent world. It's that the divine and the sacred are somehow located in this world, you could say. And so anyway, yeah, that relates to just a really important aspect for how then we understand evolution and any supposed interaction between supernatural entities and natural entities. All that becomes like profoundly problematized with this new kind of metaphysical framework. And I think that that's actually a genuinely important insight of modernity that deserves to be carried forward into the metamodern.
I actually agree. I mean, going to the Bible, right? I don't think the biblical authors thought of a natural, supernatural world, and this distinction to me is kind of weird. I have
Mm.
questions, eh, you know, and so I could get into that, but yeah, I definitely have questions, and I would
Well, I
probably
do
agree
just
with you that.
I just do want to clarify
But
too. Like, I don't want people to. I don't think they would have thought that way either. But that's because um, to have a notion like supernatural, you have to have a notion of the natural. And actually, the very idea of the natural is itself a modern invention.
mhm,
Basically, the more you get more artificial things that can distinguish from the natural, the more that the word like nature actually makes any sense as a concept. So it wasn't until modernity started getting going
mm,
where people divided that distinction. And then you could have a notion like the supernatural versus the natural. So actually, a
yeah,
lot of that kind of two worlds mythology, as we might want to language it, isn't really doesn't even show up until the modern world. And you see this in the dualisms of Descartes and all this other stuff. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some form of that thought that's implicit in the pre-modern ways of thinking about things. And then
yeah,
when you read the Bible, right, obviously, I mean, Jesus ascends into the sky, and God is talking even in Genesis about coming down to mortals on the earth and this sort of a thing, that there is already there a kind of cosmology that presumes that God is above us and, kind of comes down
Yeah.
into this world, that sort of thing. So yeah,
Above the firmament kind of thing,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Um, yeah, that I think that's totally fair, and there's a lot that could be said there. But yeah, so obviously I have think successfully to an extent integrated my faith in what I think scripture is saying with an understanding of evolution that works. There's an evolutionary theology. I love that term so much.
Hmm.
And then within that there's disagreements about how all of this works. But I there's an extent in which we can say, well, yeah, sure, that's genuine knowledge. If you want to be a metamodern Christian, we can do that, fine.
Well, I have a
um
question. I mean, what would
yeah.
you make of the notion that, yeah, like that we are a branch of a hominid species that you can track back millions of years, and that, like, would you assent to the kind of more or less standard, evolutionary account, or would there be big asterisks or qualifications that you would bring to that?
I would subscribe to the standard notion. I think there's a teleology. I think there's an
Hmm.
end.
Yeah.
I think um, that things have purpose and meaning, as
Yeah.
the metamodern would say as well. And so, but I do think those things, but I do have questions like so there's disagreement within evolutionary uh, theology and theological philosophy. I don't know, analytic philosophy about how involved God is in evolution and what that might mean. So
Hmm.
someone like Dr. Soloretter, she's actually an open theist. I won't get into what all that means, but it's not like a traditional conceptualization of God that you might hear in like classical theism and stuff. But she has an understanding which suggests that these creatures are sort of free in a very real sense to develop, change, morph, move, be on their own, uh, in a way, and of course, God empathizing with their sufferings and these sorts of things. Dr. Hart again has more teleological understanding, so he wants to say that there's meaning and purpose behind all this, and there's an end in some way. And that's been in Christian thought. He talked about an Eastern Orthodox Christian who was considering evolution and was like, "This kind of sounds like theosis," it's not the same concept, but
Hmm.
it is. You could certainly play around with that. C.S. Lewis, I think, had a similar notion.
Hmm.
Um, there are supernatural understandings where, like, no, we got to consider God's sovereignty, God's providence, His freedom. Like, He's doing something when these creatures are evolving. I'm not sure where I land there, but I would say there's purpose to the world, and I think that um, God is certainly was aware of how evolutionary history it was going to play out.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Just as an aside, and I do want to get into the other things too, but it's such
Yeah.
a rich topic. I'll just say, like, so one of the things that you get from Aristotelian philosophy are these different notions of causation, right?
Hmm.
There's efficient causation, which is like, if I hit my computer with this marker, then we can talk about what is the thing that did the thing. It's kind of an instrumental notion of I can account for the cause effect aspect there in a kind of mechanistic way. But Aristotle had other notions of causation, which included things like final causation, which is like, if you look at a flower, and then you look at like a seed, right? There's a sense in which what the flower becomes is a formal cause, that you get more of the sense of what the flower is in its sort of blooming state than you do either from its seed state or its decayed, withering state, this sort of a thing. That there's some kind of almost like that platonic form that something's aspiring to become or something like that, which is
Mm,
closest to a kind of teleological notion, which is that something has a goal or an end that it's basically trying to achieve. Um, and what's really important about the shift from the pre-modern into the modern mode for philosophy and science is that all those other forms of causation get thrown out, and modern scientists tend to just say, no, it's all efficient causation.
yeah,
And
that
so
was the
that's,
modern thesis, right?
yeah, I mean, in many ways.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, the modern synthesis.
Oh, the modern synthesis. Well, in some ways, yes. Though I would
Yeah,
add to that, which is that in that case, it also emphasizes chance.
yeah,
but still, it's an efficient causation. But I think what's really important is that this kind of Newtonian mechanistic universe that supposedly everything can be accounted for in terms of efficient causation has since been shown to be not the case, right? So like actually that's not true. Scientists now know that that's not true. But that doesn't mean that something spooky and supernatural is happening per se. What it means is that there are other aspects that actually have a causal bearing on what we see in the world. And we need a more expansive metaphysics to be able to account for this. And so there's a wonderful book by Alicia Hararo called Context Changes Everything, where she gets into a lot of this stuff in a really wonderful way, talking about how things like constraints are actually causal mechanisms, right? That basically, if you think about a traffic circle, that's going to have a causal impact on the way traffic moves, but it's not like you've hit something with another object or right? It's not an efficient
Right.
cause per se, it's a constraint. And so anyway, there's been a lot of work done in the last 30 years that basically has shown that just emphasizing efficient causation as the only mechanism in science is false. And we need a more complex notion of causation, which even includes forms of final causation, meaning some aspects of reality do have goals and ends that they are aiming towards. Now, that's not the same sort of view that per se that Aristotle had, but it's a lot closer to it, right? You actually can't understand a living organism if you don't take into account its teleological orientation, right? But like I need to do certain things to exist. If I don't eat, I fall apart, right? So
Right.
entropy and these sorts of things create constraints in such a way that if there's going to be a complex organism, it's going to have a teleological orientation. And that means that I have a final cause. Like there's actually a kind of homeostatic structure to me as an entity that you can't explain in terms of efficient causation. And this has been a big
Oh,
revolution in science. Anyway, I just wanted to know that because we return senses of or final cause to evolution. Anyway, did
yeah,
we
yeah.
can yeah.
And I think that was similar to Dr. Seth Hart's argument. Actually, uh, I might be able to get you guys connected because he also has a podcast with his best friend who I also interviewed, and so that would be
Cool.
interesting to kind of talk about. But yeah. So evolution, okay, at least for me, okay, fine. A lot of people gonna get hung up on that, but that's okay. We can have our own discussion there. However, for me and for a lot of people, the other hang up is that actually the second of three, honestly, is you want to accept the higher biblical critical scholarship. You want to accept the documentary hypothesis. So these are vocab terms. Help us understand, like, first what those are, and maybe like a basic example from
Yeah,
the Bible about
sure.
what that's saying.
Yeah, so this was a big thing for me as I was deepening my biblical studies career, which is getting into compositional history. Where did these books come from? Who wrote them? When were they written? That sort of thing. Growing up, I'd pick up my NIV study Bible and I'd look, who wrote Genesis, and it would say Moses. So it's like, okay, well, however, when you look at that question in a biblical studies context very closely, trying to engage the kind of, let's say, past 300 years of academic literature, you get a very different answer. And that has to do with a much more complex understanding of where these materials came from, the different sources that were involved, and the different ways that they came to be assembled and reworked and this sort of thing over time. So, yeah, higher criticism refers to various kinds of approaches to the Bible that want to explore its sources and where this material came from and what sense can we make of the text that we're working with. In a sense, and I think this is why it's called higher criticism. I used to know this for sure, but correct me if I'm wrong. There's a sense that, like, in order to do biblical criticism in the sense of kind of standard exegesis, like what does the text mean, you have to have a sense of what the text is first, right? So,
Hmm.
so if you're before you can really get a sense of what it means, you have to understand that. So, in this sense, it's kind of a higher level of criticism because it's trying to establish what are the kind of components of the text in some kind of original sense. And if you don't have that, then you're going to have a problem interpreting
That
it.
would kind of be meta, right?
It would kind of be
Yeah,
meta, yeah.
yeah.
And I guess ultimately, and of course, I'm always prone to accusations of ridiculous pedantry, but meta higher criticism might be something that I'd be interested in framing what I'm interested in. Anyway, so yeah, the kind of approach to the Bible then that tries to do this sort of analysis leads to a kind of source criticism. And this basically just kind of emerged organically out of the way that you read the biblical material that's there. People who want to read the text very closely are going to find that there are seeming contradictions. That the text says something here and then says a different thing here, and they're mutually exclusive. I don't know. For example, like was Joseph sold to Midianites? Or was he found in a well by Ishmaelites, right, or something like that? Like that's an example of a contradiction in the text, meaning that both of them couldn't have happened. And then you can try to account for, well, why does it say then that they both happened? Maybe Midianites were Ishmaelites, whatever. And people would try to make sense of these things. But there was some glaring issue of like, that doesn't quite work. Or another example would be, in Genesis, right? In Genesis 1, we get an order of the sequence in which God created things. And in Genesis 2, we get a different sequence, right? So like, did God create, vegetation before he made the solar, the sun or whatever, or vice versa? Some of these specifics, doesn't really matter. But the point is, if you read that Genesis 1 account of the creation of the world, God does things in a certain order. But then when you read it, Genesis 2, it doesn't conform to that order. So it's like, oh, well, wait. And when you're trying to do like really, tight, close readings of texts because you're trying to make a theological point, let's say, or whatever, these things stand out. I could go on and on and on, but I feel more compelled to give more examples of this than usual, just because probably people watching this might be more averse to the notion that there are contradictions in the Bible. So I'm happy to give many examples. I mean, another one would be in the story of Noah's ark and the flood and everything. How many animals did he bring onto the ark? Was it 2 of each kind or was it 7 of each kind? Because the text says both of those things. So which is it? And then you've got things like, what was the name of Moses's father-in-law? Was it Raul or was it Jethro? And it says it's both. Well, okay. Well, maybe he went by both names. Okay. You can start to do certain kinds of hermeneutic gymnastics here, but eventually you're sort of like, there's a lot of instances where things don't line up. They seem to be saying different things. And again, if you want, we can get more into the litanies of these sorts of things, but these are the sorts of things that were dealt with. And then there were other aspects that weren't necessarily contradictions, but they were just sort of like, like if Moses wrote, the Torah in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, if he wrote that, would he have, for example, written about the fact where it says, and Moses was the most humble person who ever lived? Well, that itself seems like an internal contradiction, right? Because who's going to say that about themselves? If he was actually the most humble person, he wouldn't have said that about himself. But that's kind of weird. Even more than that, you're like, you read in Deuteronomy, and then Moses died, and you're like, whoa, wait a second, I thought Moses wrote this. So that one's really hard. Point is, there are things like that show up where you're like, well, how does that? Okay. So basically, long story short, readers of the Bible since the Middle Ages were finding these sorts of things and focusing on them and debating them and like, how do we make sense of all this? And around, I think actually Spinoza was the first person to do this, so maybe starting in the 1600s or so, but certainly by the 1700s, you found a critical approach to the text that said, okay, well, the most sensible way of making sense of this is to say that they come from different sources, that, one source said this, and then another source said this, and then when they got combined, well, then that's where the contradiction emerges. But when they were in their original form, they weren't contradictory. And so as a working hypothesis, this was sort of explored. And as scholars really took this idea seriously, they found that actually, interesting, you can look for like the seams in the text of where these particular source differences might be and find continuities across these different seams. Like, for example, in some cases where, Moses's father-in-law is called Raul, it also calls the holy mountain where Moses received the divine revelation. And I might get mixed up on the specifics here, so forgive me. It's also been like 20 years since I really went deep into the stuff. It calls it Mount Horeb, whereas in the other case where he's called Jethro, it's called Mount Sinai. So you're not only just finding that there are contradictions, you're actually finding consistencies in the contradictions across texts. And where this really started in a major way was in the names of God. So in some passages, it would refer to God by the name Elohim. which just means kind of God. And in other contexts, it would always call him Yahweh. And again, this was one of these things where when you recognize the possibility that there might be distinct sources that have their own particular ways of talking about things, then when you matched up different names for God, this was one of those things where, oh, interesting. Bring all this together, you're like, wait a second, remember those contradictions from the Noah story and all those other things I just mentioned, Genesis and the different accounts of creation? If we see these as unique sources, almost all the time, these things align into particular source blocks that clearly kind of have a nature or a pattern or a structure to them. So that, for example, the Genesis account in Genesis 2 of the creation, that is clearly, it exhibits all the characteristics of all the other things that we find relative to that particular source material in all these other contexts. So anyway, this was sort of like, oh wow, this is a whole thing. And then in the 19th century, people started formalizing this, and they started trying to drill down, what are these sources, how many are there, how do we relate them, and then where did they come from, what's their history. And that ultimately becomes called the documentary hypothesis, which was sort of the paradigm, reigning paradigm pretty solidly for about 100 and something years, which basically identified four major strands, J, E, D, and P, in the Torah. So anyway, that's just an example, but this kind of higher criticism about, source materials also can be applied in other parts of the Bible. You can do it in the New Testament and talk about the Q source and all that, but we don't have to go there. But long and short of it is, that's kind of the historical critical method applied to the Bible that winds up giving a different sense of these different traditions. And then the last thing I'll say about that briefly is just that not only do they just say slightly different things, they actually kind of have different theological conceptions supposedly to them, right? If you read what the priestly material, it has like a particular kind of thrust or orientation nature to the God idea. And then if you read the other sources, they have kind of slightly different ones. In J, for example, or let's just say non-priestly stuff, it's a lot more anthropomorphic. God is a lot more sort of almost like Zeus-like in the way that you might read it in the Greek material, of like a God who is very anthropomorphic and does a lot of things. For example, in the J account, when you separate out the sources in the Noah story, God literally like closes up the ark with his hand, and it's in the non-priestly account in Genesis 2, where God breathes life actually into the nostrils of human beings after sculpting them, out of dirt and walking in the garden and all this stuff. Whereas the priestly material, God speaks things into creation, and he never does this sort of like, highly anthropomorphic stuff. He's much more abstract and kind of removed and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that's kind of a kind of quick summary of that material. And the last thing I'll say, sorry, there's multiple last things I want to say, is that this can also be a little bit disconcerting for folks, because then you're sort of like, well, what's the, which one's real? Like, what's accurate, so to speak? Meaning that there are theological implications to this. To go back to that notion of the higher criticism before you can do the kind of more immediate textual analysis, like what a text means when actually you do this kind of work and separate out the texts into different texts. Now the text means something different. And I'll give you the most radical example of that. This one's controversial, though, so this might be too far, but it gives you a sense of the sorts of ways that these things can change your understanding of the text. In the kind of canonical version, of course, you read the story about the binding of Isaac. Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him, and then he goes to do it, but then he's stopped by an angel, and then there's a ram there, and they kill the ram instead, and then they go on, and Isaac, has kids and grows up and all this stuff. It turns out, though, that actually when you separate the source strands there, which should, in this case would be J and E, I think. It might be, is it P and E? Anyway, when you separate the sources, in one of the sources, Abraham goes up the hill with Isaac to sacrifice him, and then it ends. And then Isaac doesn't show up in the rest of that source. It's the E source. So in the E source, did Abraham actually sacrifice Isaac? Like that becomes a hermeneutical interpretation that is possible. And so what we're going to interpret the text to mean and what its significance is now very different than if we just read it in its canonical form where it's all smushed together. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. I think you gave a good synopsis. I do listen to critical scholars talk about some of these things. So it sounded familiar to me for sure as I was listening to you talk about these things. Um, have you and I'm curious because I have questions about that whole framework of reading the text. Have you seen some of the like and I don't some of the more rigorous academic responses from Christians of to that. So I think one book that was really helpful for some people is a book called The Composition of the Pentateuch, where they talk about it's like, yeah, Moses isn't writing all 5 books of the Old Testament. Yeah, there are sources, but this, as far as I understand their argument, what's happening with this stuff that's the critical scholars are doing is going too far,
Mhm.
and there's fine understandings of this that fit within the contemporary
Hmm.
theology, and so they kind of talk for example, I was doing a lot of research on slavery, so I read the pages that they had about biblical slavery, and if you read the slave laws in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25, they look different.
Mhm.
And their understanding was that Deuteronomy was that one of the law sets updates the previous one.
Mhm.
And so for them, it's not like there were sources behind these that like contradicted each other, but rather the community updated their understanding. Which, like, as I understand law in the ancient Near East and how law would have functioned
Mhm.
in that cultural historical context, that's perfectly fine to do. Makes a lot of sense, all that sort of stuff. So that's just like one example. They do other things in the book, but yeah, I'm
Well, so
curious.
yeah, so a lot to all that. One is
Yeah.
okay, out of the gate, did have documentary hypothesis scholars, let's just say critical scholars, have they gone too far in the past? Yes. like there was a point where this stuff got so out of hand where people, they'd write a dissertation on, oh, I found a sub source in this source that's a hypothetical source of this and blah blah blah. Right. It winds up, you get into so many redactional layers that people are trying to find. At a certain point, it becomes just superfluous, unnecessary, dot dot dot. So I think some of the things that have happened in the field have recognized that as a legitimate, there's just it was overdone. And, implicit in that is that there is, you know, there are ways in which there can be very easy methodological failures here. There's a line of circular reasoning that one is liable to fall into, right? That's possible, and so one has to be on guard against that sort of thing. And so, unfortunately, yeah, the field didn't do itself any favors by the time you get into the 20th century of people, trying to, just hyper divide these texts and do all this stuff. So that is true, but in the sense that they went too far with it. Is the basic insight true? I do ultimately believe it is, and actually, I think it has the same name as that book you mentioned, "The Composition of the Pentateuch." Is a work by Joel Bodden, who's a Yale Divinity School professor, and he's sort of doing basically just being like, let's pare down this hypothesis. Let's not do any of that crazy stuff. Like he sets certain very strict criteria, and it's just sort of like there's literary continuity or there's not, and let's work it this way. And he's done a lot to get rid of all that dross and all those epicycles, as it were, in some of where this field has been taken. So there's internal to the field itself some critique that is already there, and I think is hashing out. But that's also very different from people outside the field, or I shouldn't say outside the field, but outside of that paradigm, like more conservative scholars who are critiquing the whole paradigm as being fundamentally flawed. That's a different kind of critique. But anyway, so naming that on the one hand, I think what you're getting at is that, okay, people can be open to reading this more along an axis rather than a simple kind of either or. Did Moses write it or not?
Right.
And so I think that's fair. That's fine if people want to start moving that direction. But it does already begin to open up new possibilities along an axis. So, for example, you mentioned the slave laws. Like, each of those codes of law are presented in the Bible in the sense of these are the laws that are given to Moses in the revelation from God. So if we're going to interpret some of them as being updating the other ones, we're already breaking the sort of internal literary conceit of how these things are being framed in the biblical text itself.
Oh, I see.
And so that
Yeah.
already starts to then be like, oh, and again, that's fine if people want to make that move, but that itself might be disconcerting to more conservative scholars,
Right.
right? And the other thing I'd say about that is that even a move like that, while I think it's in the right direction, is going to find its own problems. For example, one of the things that we've learned about Hebrew over the past century is that you can find particular stages of its own development, right? In the
Yeah.
same way that, Chaucer is a different kind of English than Shakespeare is a different kind of English from Hemingway, that sort of thing, right? There are
Hmm.
stages of the language's development, and scholars have identified, classical biblical Hebrew, archaic Hebrew, Persian era Hebrew, the sorts of things. And there are ways of being able to make these distinctions. Now, if you're going to say that Moses still wrote the bulk of, let's say, the Torah, albeit with some sources that he was compiling, you're going to face the problem that the language of those materials is not written in the era of biblical or of Hebrew that you would expect to find, let's say, right? You
Mm.
could say, all right, well, if Moses, it depends, of course, when you play Moses, but if he's sometime around, I don't know, 1200, then we have a sense of what Hebrew looked like around 1200 from various epigraphic, kinds of remains and stela and stuff. And so it's like, no, that actually is a very clearly the text is written in a later Hebrew than that. And so that would be a problem there. To say nothing of the other fact of other certain problematic aspects that are just more ingrained in the text. For example, we know when camels were domesticated into anyway. The point is that even
We
those
get into the weeds.
yeah, but the point is that even making that kind of a condescension maybe to their resources, but still Moses wrote it, doesn't resolve a lot of these other things. And this is also really important too, because this gets us outside of biblical uh, composition history and higher criticism, but into the field more broadly in ways that also problematize traditional narratives. When you look at the archaeology, right? Like if we're going to situate Moses in a particular time, when do we do that? Well, all right, well, when did the Exodus occur? And if we can look at the archaeological remains from that, like that should give us a sense. And then you go looking for the archaeological remains of the Exodus and you don't find any, right? And then you actually look all over. I mean, Israel is one of the most excavated, places in the world, archaeologically speaking. And so there's actually a very kind of decent picture of the kind of various strata going all the way back of that area, and you don't see in that data the story as it's told in the Old Testament. And so again, that's one of those things from biblical studies that you're like, ooh, that's a difficult thing to square with the reading of the text versus the kind of empirical facts. So yeah, these are other aspects beyond higher criticism that lead to more complex ways that modernity and its critical methods problematized, more kind of pre-modern approaches.
And the third thing, so the third thing that you talk about that you think like to be a metamodern Christian, because this is what this is all about, right? You're saying we need to encapsulate the genuine knowledge from these different periods. That's why we kind of got into the weeds about evolution and the documentary hypothesis and stuff, because it uh your understanding is that this is the genuine knowledge that came up from modernity. Another thing that you talk about is the distinction, which is also going to make a lot of Christians uncomfortable, between, say, the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And so those terms have been used to kind of distinguish a sort of rigorous historical approach to the character with a methodological, you say mythological approach to the character, which makes him God incarnate, right? And so you've particularly focused on the miracles, and you say some of this is just stuff that straight up could not have happened, or like there are logistical problems here. And so I guess what would be like the best example of using the genuine knowledge that we got from this historical period, you just cannot affirm this miracle.
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, I want to go back to some of the biblical studies stuff because I want to hear more of your perspective on that and see if we can get into more of the weeds on this. Because
Yeah.
I also, I'm interested to hear what some of the more kind of conservative alternative interpretations might be that take a different approach.
Mhm.
But on that front, yeah. So one of the videos I made was really to try to make a point that, again, some people will say, well, if you presume that miracles are impossible, then of course, you're going to read the New Testament and say, oh, this didn't happen. And I was
Hmm.
trying to say, no, that's not the move that's being done. While it is true that overall the modern philosophical natural scientific approach that was ushered in rejected notions of miracles for metaphysical reasons, you could say. That is not necessarily the sort of move that needs to happen in biblical studies. There are just other reasons that problematize miracles. And also, by the way, I mean, the philosophical critique is nothing to shake a stick at. We read some Hume, and we read, anyway, there's reasons for like taking very seriously
For
the,
sure.
the question of the metaphysics or the reality of miracles. Anyway, um, yeah. So one of the big things for me that came about from my studies was just reading more materials. I think that it's the sort of thing that if one's only working with a very small subset of material, then you don't really have a lot to base your understanding of that on, compare it with other things, etc. Like if I only have one language, I'm not going to understand grammar very well because I haven't been able to compare multiple languages to one another to see, oh yeah, that's a definite article and that's a verb or whatever. So one of the things for me was just in reading more of the biblical material and the extra biblical material and the intertestamental material and all that was sort of, it gave context for the stuff I was reading in a way that I hadn't necessarily expected. Right. So if people just think, hey, yeah, I mean, most of the time when you read ancient literature, things happen as normal, but then, oh wow, there was like these gospels that were written, and then they describe all these miracles, and like this is unlike anything, and we got to take that very seriously on its own terms. That's not the case, right? When you read other ancient
Yeah.
materials, it's like, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of miraculous stuff being talked about. And
Right.
so if you read, for example, oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh no, I was just saying, right. Yeah.
Oh,
I because I've read a lot of this literature as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, you read like Apollonius of Tyana or some of Lucian's stuff, or, I mean, on and on and on. Obviously, epic literature and everywhere, right? Like the ancient world was full of stories like this. And so that I think is at least just background context for a sense of like, why do we privilege some miraculous material in the ancient world versus others? This isn't a very strong argument. It's just a context. It's just sort of like, oh, actually, there's not anything specific about this material per se that marks it off from other material. And so anyway, more specifically, like in the one of the things I talk about in that like video on the miracle question is just to understand the kinds of processes that went into writing the text themselves. Again, if we don't study the time period and we don't have a sense for what ancient literature was like and the kinds of presuppositions people were using, then we're going to misunderstand the text. So, for example, again, how many people have necessarily read Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, right? But if you read that, then you read instances where he's describing, speeches that are given by Pericles and Alcibiades and these various historical figures. And Thucydides wasn't there, and it's not like anyone was there writing all this down. You realize that he's just filling in the blanks, that like, well, we know that Pericles made an announcement or he made a funeral oration or something, right? So, okay, I guess I've got to write that, and then you might say, well, wait a second, people can't just make stuff up. And then it's like, well, actually, yes, they did. Like the notion that people couldn't just make stuff up owes to a presupposition about historiography that is inherently a modern presupposition. You don't get history per se the way that we think of history until the modern period. If you want to read the first historian, so-called Herodotus, whose book The Histories, you can go check out. You're going to say, oh, okay, great, I'm going to go read some history, I'm going to read the first historian. And then you pick it up and you read about people riding on the backs of dolphins and going up into the sky and all this stuff, and you're like, whoa, wait a second, this doesn't sound like history. It's like, yes, it's not history. History itself is a developmental a genre that has its own history, you could say. And
Right.
again, you can start to see why the value for meta stuff here. You need a history of history to understand what you're really reading. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot that goes into misunderstanding texts if we're lacking certain kinds of vital contextual information. If we don't know that we're watching, a horror film, no, that's a bad example. If we don't know that we're watching a mockumentary, right, Spinal Tap, and we think that we're watching a real documentary, we're going to be misled in terms of understanding what this text is about. So anyway, yeah, when you look at the Gospels, you have to situate them in the context that they arise from and understand the kinds of generic, meaning genre-related thinking that goes behind where these texts emerge from. And it is not, with the one exception maybe being Luke in this case, who is more inspired by kind of Greco-Roman historiography. But by and large, you're not getting people who are trying to just give you a factual recounting of things as though this is precisely what happened.
Right.
That's just not the orientation. So then, yeah, go ahead.
And so like I'm sold on the understanding that we need historical context for that. At least I am, because that's what I was taught to do in biblical interpretation class, right?
Yeah.
That's what you need to do. And like doing research on the historical background has illuminated my understanding of the Bible a lot. It's one of the reasons why I think evolution is actually compatible with the Bible. Going back to that point, is because I've done some of that.
Mhm.
But uh, what is a case in which like a specific miracle's history is called into question, either because like the logistics of it, like wait, when you think about this, it just doesn't work, or
Mm.
because of this background literature that you're referring to.
Yeah, so let's maybe think about the birth account in Luke, right? Which is the one where there's the star that appears to the shepherds, and then the magi come from the. Oh wait, am I getting this? Yeah, this is part of the problem too, is that we tend to conflate all these things together.
Yeah.
All right, let me back up. There are two birth accounts. There's four gospels, but there's only two birth accounts, and we find them in Matthew and Luke.
Hmm.
Um, and so they're actually that itself is interesting, right? The fact that the earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't have that. um it's just evidence from absence, I guess, but maybe there's a suggestion, something about where did this material come from, and what did it emerge after some of the more basic stuff got written down and conveyed, or and what sort of things happen when there's a increasing time between events, and people writing things down and having time to tell stories and whatnot. But anyway, the birth account of Jesus, where there's a star, and there's the census that occurs,
Hmm.
and all of that.
The
And you get
census is in Luke, at least. Yeah.
the census is in Luke, right?
Yeah.
And whereas in Matthew, right, there's this whole thing about the slaughtering of the Herod is told about the prophecy and all this stuff, and then he tries to kill Jesus in infancy and all this, and then they escape
Yeah.
to Egypt and all that. Anyway, so that's just an example of, all right, here we have two miraculous birth accounts, but when you actually try to add them up or sync them up together, they don't really sync up very well. And so again, like, yeah, logistical problem there. Or you could say, if you were to say, wow, okay, so there's this census that is instituted. Well, what do we know about that? And did it actually require people to go back to their ancestral homeland? And it's like, no, it didn't. And anyway. So you can also triangulate with other kinds of existing historical information. But particularly you're facing this issue of contradiction again. And so people historically, exegetes, have always tried to just smush stories together to make it say that both of these things happened. But there's like a question there: did they both happen? Like, what did both the Herod thing happen and the census thing happen, and did they both go to Egypt? But then also this whole thing with Bethlehem and the manger, and all this whole kind of mixture of things is clearly, I think, best read as, okay, there needs to be a birth account of Jesus, right? So fill in the details. And then either the writer makes that up, or probably more likely, the writer draws on some various kinds of rumors or tales or things that they might have heard in kind of oral traditions to do that kind of work. And so then you get basically the details filled in, but filled in specific ways, right? And I guess this is kind of the point I was trying to make in that video, which is that, when I was growing up, for example, one of the biggest apologetic arguments that I found really, really mind blowing and like utterly convincing was that Jesus fulfilled like 10,000 prophecies or something like that. I forget the exact number. It was something like, it was in the hundreds. It was like 700 prophecies. And that the chance of a person doing that was 1 in 10 to the da 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 da. And I don't know who computed that and how you would even compute that. But
Yeah,
I remember reading that in Josh McDowell's The Evidence That Demanded Murder. It was like, whoa, okay.
yeah,
So, wow. I mean, this doesn't just happen. But what people didn't consider, apparently, was that maybe some of these prophecies, let's say, so called, were the basis out of which the stories themselves were constructed, right? Meaning, if
yeah.
you're expecting a Messiah and you're expecting him to come from Bethlehem, right? That's what the pre-existing tradition that the Jesus story enters into. And why Bethlehem? Well, because King David is from Bethlehem, and the Messiah is supposed to be the kind of returning Davidic, king, and all this stuff. So, okay, so the Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem, and then once you get a tradition that emerges that Jesus was the Messiah, but then it's like, well, wait a second, but Jesus was from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. I thought the Messiah is supposed to be from Bethlehem. Well, now you've got some question mark there. So you've got a tradition and you've got the kind of historical fact of Jesus being from Nazareth. And so if someone asks, well, where was Jesus born? Well, he had to have been born in Bethlehem. And we know that that had to have been the case because of the prophecy. But then in terms of the facts around that, that's where things start getting really squishy, because in order to get Jesus to Bethlehem, you have the different birth accounts doing that in different ways and telling a different story. And so it seems that a lot of the stories, including the miraculous stories, including also the prophecy fulfillment stories, come about as sort of like you already have the preset notion, the prejudiced concluding pre-conclusion that such and such is going to happen. And so that then you fill in the blanks and tell the version of the story that has Jesus doing that thing. And so that would be sort of a completely different line of argumentation for understanding where a lot of this material comes from. That's not just saying, oh, miracles aren't possible, but it's saying, well, why does Jesus do some of the specific things that he's said to have done? And then you can say, oh, well, because, the writers were using the existing tradition to present him in a certain way, which opens up actually really fascinating ways of, doing exegesis, because then you can start reading the gospel stories and being like, oh, yeah, like this is trying to convey a particular theological message. And that's kind of the point that I'm getting at here, which isn't my point. I mean, this is what kind of standard biblical criticism in New Testament studies has been getting at for, I don't know, over a century, which is like, once you realize that the Gospels aren't historical materials, what are they? They're a kind of hagiography, right? They're writing stories about someone sage-like and saintly and revered, and they're trying to present that person not only in the best light, but in terms that that are framed by their theology. Because this person, Jesus, has a theological significance to people, and they're trying to make that clear. And so they're trying to tell stories that get that across. And once you understand that the impetus is not, let's be the most historically, factually accurate as we can be, it's how do we tell this story that will present Jesus in this theologically significant way, then you can start to understand the sorts of miraculous events that we read in the Bible. Yeah.
And so you talk a little bit about that. As a real quick thing before I ask this like final question, so you've taken these insights from the modern period. Presumably, you've taken some Christian tradition stuff in some ways from the pre-modern era. What have you taken, say, theologically or something like that, from the postmodern era to inform this metamodern Christianity?
Yeah, but I feel like we're breezing through. We gotta get. I mean, I don't have many opportunities to talk to people in Bible schools, and so
That's fair. That's fair.
I don't want to just like. Yeah, I was kind of hoping more of this would come up in the class presentation, and it didn't. But like, I want some more like dialogue on these sorts of things and pushback and this sort of thing, because what I don't want to do. I remember, I would listen to, I don't know, people I interpreted as sort of godless atheist biblical scholars trail on, and I would just say, oh, that's a bunch of nonsense, and they just don't get it. And I can imagine that if I just talk and I present certain ideas, people might just think that about me. So I think it's more important to kind of get into some of these things and try to unpack them a little bit, because there's a lot of nuance to all this. I also, just on that last front, I don't want to give the impression that like it's nonsense to say that Jesus was made up. Like, Jesus was a historical figure.
Right.
He did things, and those things included exorcisms and feats of wonder. So like it's not like the gospel writers were making that up. Jesus was believed to have done miraculous things, and I think historically we can say that people experienced him doing miraculous things.
Mm.
But this again is like a huge point that I think once you even grant that, um, we have to situate ourselves to understand what we're actually getting from the text, right? In the same way that when you talk about Thucydides and you actually just think about it and you're like, wait a second, Thucydides wasn't there. How does he know that this was said? Then it immediately opens up this distance of like, oh, actually, we're getting something mediated through Thucydides, and we're not actually getting exactly what was said. And so now we have to pay attention to that. And so similarly, I think that one of the kind of most important things to do in a biblical hermeneutic sense is to not forget the fact that we're getting a mediated story, and to pay attention to the storyteller and what it is that they're trying to convey, and how is it different from what other people are trying to convey. Like, that's a genuinely important aspect of not just modern critical studies, but to come back to your question, postmodern analysis, right? Which is about perspectives, which is that people are coming from places and contexts and situatedness, right? And that rather than try to find always the universal account of something, what we should be doing many times, at least, is focusing on what are the particular things that make this a particular thing. How is this different from everything else? How is it idiosyncratic? What are the particulars? And I think that there's a real lesson there for biblical exegesis, because Matthew is telling a different story than Luke is telling. Like, and in that sense, Matthew's Jesus is kind of different from Luke's Jesus, right? Matthew's Jesus is very Jewish. He's a very, that's the Jesus that says, don't mistake me, not one jot or tittle will be lost from the law, before these things are accomplished, or whatever the exact phrasing is, meaning that, like, no, the law's still in place there, right? But then you read Luke's Jesus and you get a much more kind of Greco-Roman oriented kind of Jesus. And this isn't just to undermine our sense of confidence in the text, as though we just, enjoy problematizing things, though I think that's a problem of postmodernism. It can be genuinely productive, because then we can actually engage with the real nuance of these particular authors, their particular perspectives. What are they actually trying to say? Read them on their own terms. And then you can start to triangulate, and you can start to see, some of the deeper elements of things going on there. So,
Yeah, this
yeah.
I think that's all fair. And so, yeah, sticking with that for a minute then, one of the things that I found really interesting is, uh, as someone who has not done a lot of rigorous study into New Testament reliability or gospel reliability, was the argument from undesigned coincidences
Mm,
that you these things, I can't remember specifics off the top of my hand, but you have these sort of things and instances that happen in one text that kind of get explained in another without
mm,
any clear colluding to make that happen. And so it would almost it would be like, if I took a group of my friends out to a restaurant, and I was telling one of my other friends about it. I said, "Yeah, me and three other guys went to this restaurant, and we, were having fun and stuff like that. And then, we had a conversation with the waiter that was interesting. And then and then I said, we talked about faith or something like vaguely, right? And then that friend, I don't know why this hypothetical friend would do this, but this friend like goes to that waiter and says, "Hey, what'd you guys talk about?" And he's like, and like independent verification that not only did we talk about faith, but like she can remember specifics of the conversation that I didn't talk about. And then I can, and then, let's say that she had to leave to go wait another table or something like that. And then I can come around and say independently again, verify, oh yeah, she did end up leaving at some point. and maybe I explained that in the initial story, but not
Yeah.
but didn't explain why. And then she, undesigned, tells us why.
Yeah.
Let's go with that, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the argument, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on
Well,
that.
I think, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think you'd have to be able to show some of, let's say, some cases of that are very ironclad, and I think that'd be very hard to do for many reasons. One is, it's just that's an interpretive issue, right? Like so much of the thing about reading so much biblical material is you're like, wait, something's missing here. But it's like, well, wait, no, it's not. Like when you read the Binding of Isaac story, you're like, what's Abraham thinking? And what are Isaac thinking? And you're thinking, oh, it's like, oh, this, the author has deliberately left this out. It's a lacuna that, creates all this narrative tension. It's like, no, it's just not there. And we are reading our modern expectations of literature into a very ancient text.
Mm,
And so I think some of those things would have to be presented in such a way where it was very, very clear that this was not just a matter of interpretation. It was actually something, at least, let's say, as close to, mm, I mean, part of me hangs up on that because, what we read as interpretation and what we don't read as interpretation is itself open for interpretation. But I
yeah.
guess what I'm getting at is you'd have to have some really, really strong examples, and then you'd have to where it's not just a matter of, oh, we would expect this, but when we don't find it until we see it over here, and it's like, well, I think you're just reading that into the text. The other
Mm,
thing I would say too, though, is that even if that kind of sense that something was missing and then getting fulfilled somewhere else was occurring, we can't necessarily leave that out of bounds of the possibility that was the authors themselves doing that, right? So one of the things that we see a lot is that Matthew and Luke both improve Mark's text, right? Presuming Mark in priority, that they're using him as a source, and at least there was some way in which these sources were using each other, because otherwise it wouldn't be the Synoptic Gospels. We can see all the time basically improving the text as it is. And that can be simple grammatical stuff, like Mark will express it in terms of terse, this happened, then this happened. And then like Matthew will use like a participle and make a more flowy sentence or something. But we also find that in terms of missing details, right? Like in Mark's account of the temptation of Jesus in the desert, it's very sparse. It's just like Jesus went in the desert, driven there by the Holy Spirit. He was with the animals. He encountered, Satan came and tempted him, and he rebuked him, and then he went and was ministered upon by angels or something. Now, clearly, people were like, "Whoa, what happened there?" Right? And what happened there, we
yeah.
get in Mark, in Matthew's accounts, and they fill in a lot of those details with some other kinds of traditional material. But that's not because necessarily that's what really happened. It's because maybe either people read Mark's account and they're like, wow, like what happened there, and someone tells that story, or there are other instances in which just something is glaringly absent from a particular thing, again from someone's interpretation, that when we read it in another case it's sort of like, oh yeah, well that would have been confusing, and so we can see why this author was sort of adding that in to make this a more kind of coherent text. So anyway, the point is just that some of that stuff can be other aspects to the compositional history going way back. Yeah, I mean, and I think a big part of all this too that I want to stress is that people can hear all this. I know that when I heard a lot of biblical critical stuff that didn't jive with my own, view of reality, it landed as very disappointing and very sad, because it sounded like, oh well, I guess this is all just meaningless, and it's like, no, I don't want to give the impression that like the Bible or the New Testament or whatever is like, because it's not some perfectly accurate historical document, is either meaningless, or that the Jesus story is meaningless, or that it's all made up, or it's all false. There's all these shades of nuance and complexity that we should be able to be receptive to, and different ways of reading the text that can be really, really meaningful and valuable, which also goes back to this question or insinuation from a second ago of like, what from the pre-modern is being taken into this metamodern view here, right? Well, like the whole Jesus tradition, the whole Christian tradition is there to carry forward into the metamodern perspective. It's just a matter of what we do with it, how we understand it, and so, we have this rich tradition, but we don't have to necessarily understand it from the lens in which it was produced. We can understand it from a more reflective lens, and that can open the aperture, I'm mixing metaphors, to our whole perspective on all these things in a way that can make things more rich and more meaningful, albeit more complex and more nuanced, but like I think that that's an important thing to do. So anyway, I wanted to say all that. And then yeah, we can come back to well, we can go wherever you want.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I guess related to all this then, we talked about this in class, and I'll state it differently this time to kind of, like, reflect back on the whole, like, metamodern thing and this hierarchy of complexity and development. Um, it seems more to me, it seems more developmentally complex to have a understanding of this grand narrative of God that encompasses a historical incarnation of himself and a the whole Philippians 2 thing, right, of the exaltation also of himself in the end with all, sort of bowing down and worshiping. There's and the divine drama of the union of God and creation. It seems more complex to think of this as historically true and, like,
Mm,
what is actually going to happen, what has
mm,
happened,
mhm,
what is happening to me experientially, and then what will happen, rather than just mythologically, outside of history.
mm,
And so, like, it could, and I'm, again, being a theistic evolutionist, I'm open, for example, to the idea that Genesis 1 through 11 is like a mythology in that it is not historical but still true. So
mhm,
I understand this idea that
yeah,
something, like Spider-Man is true, right? Like
yeah,
not historically, but
right,
in that what he embodies is true.
sure,
What the message that the story is conveying is true. And
yeah,
so I understand that.
mhm,
But to me, it seems more complex to say what is happening here in the Gospels, and then that being an example of this divine drama of the union of God and
mm, mhm.
creation, it seems more complex. And so would you be more inclined under a metamodern framework than to accept the resurrection, a historical Jesus, a historical eschatology, rather than a mythological one?
It's a nice argument. It makes
Yeah.
me think of like Kierkegaard, basically saying that, because the incarnation is the most absurd thing he could possibly conceive of, it was the thing that he could have the most faith in. Um, and which isn't a knock, right? I mean, it's
Mhm.
kind of that sort of argument. Um, I mean, I guess what I'd say to that briefly is one, it's not just complexity for complexity's sake. That we should value something like you can make something hyper complex. It doesn't have to be right.
Right.
And that's one note. And the other note is I'm not sure if that even is the case. I mean, maybe it is that would be more complex. But you'd have to make a case for that. I guess I'd have to see that argument there. But the other thing, the most important thing, is that I'm up for and I favor when it comes to a Christian exegesis, a meta-modern Christian exegesis of seeing this as being real, and not just true in a mythic sense, but like real, but not necessarily true historically in the past, though it might be mythologically true and historically real in the future, if that makes any sense. Meaning, and also for the record, I totally, yes, if people want to lean into the profound, sublime mystery of God becoming man as the nexus of their faith, I totally get that, and I don't even like. There's not a part of me that wants to say, "Oh, don't do that." I'm not. That's not doesn't enter into it.
Which I also
Uh,
appreciate from the metamodern.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the way I like to read it, at least, and is that it is mythically true in the sense that uh, the historical reading of God becoming human is what the Gospels are about, and that is a truth. And that not only is it true in the like, I'll put it this way: Spider-Man will never be historically accurate.
Right.
He'll always be true, I guess, or the Dark Knight or Batman or whoever. Like these things, that Lord of the Rings, they all be true, but you will never achieve a historical reality in which there's a Frodo Baggins or a Spider-Man. I don't think that is the case with the Christian story, meaning the union of God and world. We can imagine as becoming historically real. Did it happen in first century Palestine? People can see it that way if that's what's most convincing to them. I lean into the notion that what happened in first century Palestine produced a mythos that orients us to a kind of truth that will become historical reality uh, as we participate in it. That would
So you
be, yeah.
and so because I have a little bit of background on this, like I said, because I've seen your stuff. You want to say, because again, you would say you're a theist, right? You might have a different understanding of God than the Christian classical theist, but you want to say you're a theist, and so you have said, to my understanding, that history is a unfolding of the divine throughout time. Think,
Mm,
um, for Christian language, think dispensational theology or covenantal theology. How there's different covenants, there's different periods of time in which God is working differently with the world and has different ethics. Even I've talked about this with regards to some apologetics, and these other things, right?
mhm.
And so you want to say that God is certainly real, and the unfolding of history is a unfolding of a divine drama. That's certainly true,
Mhm.
and that what that's going to get us to is historically true because
Yes.
we or humanity is going to experience that.
Yeah.
Um, what that is for me, though, is something like what the Book of Revelation, Philippians 2, these
Mm,
other things
mhm.
have panned out. What is that eschatology
Yeah.
to say for
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. Well, good question. I mean, this is that
Mm,
teleology thing again.
yeah.
It is. I mean, I'm open to this, and I think we have to be open to it because emergence is unpredictable, and I don't want to have a too much of a pre-given sense of what to expect. I also think that there's a kind of reverence for the mystery as such that we don't want to. It says we shouldn't put God to the test, but we also shouldn't expect to know, you know, God in God's fullness in advance. Let's say. But all that being said, I interpret it as something like the full infusion of the world with divine mind. You know, if we think about the incarnation in its sort of archetypal form, you're talking about God becoming creation. And I think if you just sort of abstractify that a little bit more, you can think about, all right, well, by God here, we're talking about not just consciousness, but a kind of full expansive consciousness that is, you know, nearing infinity in terms of intelligence and these sorts of things. So let's just say, however we want to particularly define that, there's some kind of highly expansive, deep, profound consciousness. And that is gaining an incarnational reality. Um, I see that as being possible in many ways historically in the future, as an extrapolation of versions of it that we've already seen. And I would say that in some ways, if you do want to think about this historically in the past, you can look at the emergence of Homo sapiens. You can look at the emergence of human consciousness out of animal consciousness as a moment in this process where
Mm,
that divine spark enters in, you could say, or emerges out of an incarnational substrate in such a way that illumines and opens and creates new capacities and sets the developmental evolutionary stage with so much more as its realm of possibility. So I would look at something similar happening in the future and continuing to happen, you know, through a series of sort of punctuated equilibria and kind of meta state transitions of deepening and expanding consciousness, which isn't just awareness, but it's also moral regard and a sense of what the identity is, right? So I guess this is how I would think about it, right? Is that as consciousness expands, the very notion of what the self is also expands. And you can look at this in developmental terms. But as people develop to very complex forms of understanding what they are, they start to realize, oh, I'm not just, you know, an individual. I'm actually part of a network social structure, and like who I am is mediated by the language I use. That's a collective representation. Dot 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 dot. And you know who I am is the consequence of billions of years of evolution and millions of years of, or let's say billions of years of cosmic evolution and millions of years of biological evolution. All this stuff. Um, that like the self concept expands so much that also the sense of care and regard expands, of like, what do I care about? Well, if I'm so much, then I need to care about pretty much everything. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that I can imagine the reality, the incarnational reality that we experience as the world, being more and more suffused with that. And I don't know what that looks like, right? I don't know. You could imagine any way that this could manifest. It could be that human beings, evolve, continue to evolve and then develop, increased capacities, dot, dot, dot. Maybe we're at a certain joint point with our technology. Maybe that's one way it looks. Maybe another way it looks is that, hey, when you look at the cosmic filamental structure of the universe itself, it looks like shocking mathematically, even like a neuronal structure that we see in our own human mind. Is that a neuronal structure waiting to wake up? I don't know what that means, but maybe. I mean, I don't know the answer, but I do see that cosmic complexification tends in the direction of some form of what I'm talking about, and that to me would be maybe the kind of eschatological realization of this, and maybe there have been intimations of this all along the way. And for all I know, maybe one particular special salient kind of very unique form of this did happen in first century Palestine. So there's all sorts of ways that can be made sense of.
Yeah, it's a it's a very different eschatology than what definitely what Christian had proposed. I know I use the language of deification
Hmm.
because I borrow this from I mean both the Protestant, really the Christian tradition, because it's in the Protestants, it's in Roman Catholic literature, and it's also in
Yeah,
the Church Fathers. It's
yeah,
the
definitely.
language that Eastern Orthodox Christians use. So I have this understanding that we will become gods, but and so what it sounds like you're saying is that in an archetypal sense, God becomes the creature. Um, in the in your eschatology, if you had to put it that way, the creature becomes enfolded into God, right?
Yeah.
Would that
Well, I want to also be open. I'm open to a couple of different framings for this, and one of them, which I lean towards, but I'm not sold on, is just when we talk about God and we talk about, there's an implicit kind of frame there that like God exists somewhere in his totality and either comes down or enters into or whatever.
right?
I'm not so sure about that. I'm very open to the idea that, and this might be really a challenging sort of thought, but it's a compelling one, which is something like God is not yet fully anywhere. The most fully God is in us. Maybe we are, again, that incarnational means by which God fully experiences God's self. So I don't necessarily believe that we are necessarily relating to God. Like here's the difference, right? Like in this dispensationalist kind of theology, I probably always, maybe there are exceptions, but I would assume that the norm is that God is God and God's perfect and God's eternal and God's sovereign and all this stuff, and he just reveals himself differently, kind of to condescend to the human mind over history. But that's sort of him condescending to us from his state of perfection. There's a different approach to this that could be like, well, maybe as the whole evolutionary complexification and developmental process unfolds, God God's self is emerging more and coming to an expression that maybe God didn't even know, in the past. And there are forms of
Hmm,
Whiteheadian theology, process theology, Jungian thought that are very much in this line, which I find very attractive for many reasons. I don't know if it's right or the best way of reading it. It creates its own
interesting.
problems, but it's a very fascinating notion. Like if you've ever read Jung's Answer to Job. Um, anyway, there's a whole line and we could get into, but like,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's something also that's very beautiful for me about that tracks very closely with other aspects of the Christian tradition, which is that idea that we are the body of Christ, that we are the hands and feet of Christ, and that what we do in the world is, we could think about it as creating the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, but like we are that legacy, as it were. And maybe that's always been what it is. And maybe that maybe the Christ insight that did occur in first century Palestine historically was a person realizing, hey, wow, we're conduits for the divine, and like I and the Father are one, and that's enough
Yeah.
of a mystical insight that could really jumpstart 2,000 years of spiritual history.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and so then what is meant there is, yeah, definitely different than how I would use this term deification, because all I mean is that um if something has an attribute of the fullness of divinity, like the God who exhausts the category of divine itself,
Mm,
um if something has a attribute of that, then there's a sense in which that is divine.
mm,
And so if God does not change in his essence, and let's just say hypothetical, the moon does not change in its essence, then in a sense, the moon is divine because it's reflecting that the
huh.
an attribute of it. And
Yeah.
so we humans are and I'm going to say particularly the body of Christ, the church. Um, because I don't lean universalist as of yet, is going to experience that deification where they take on the attributes of divinity, which I think Paul and others point out as just like it's moral perfection, it's a glorified body, and it's eternality, which is something that we are not as of yet.
Mm,
And I'm a annihilationist. I have that understanding of hell. And so I really think we you will have a start and you will have an end unless Christ gives you literal, physical, eternal life,
mm,
by allegorically speaking, being our tree of life that we have to
mhm,
eat from in order to live. And so that's my understanding, right? And but that's very informed by my understanding of scripture and how widespread this stuff is across church tradition. But and a metamodern frame wants to take that and go, yeah, but how about we expand all these categories and all of what this means?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, it's
Yeah.
interesting because again, my take on the metamodern Christianity thing, which other people will have different takes, but my take is very much it's the reconstruction after deconstruction. So
Hmm.
once you've deconstructed things, which I experienced, my whole Christian faith, it broke apart. I no longer had it. I was a nihilist, like
Yeah.
so. I have experienced that to to then begin to say, hey, maybe we can put these pieces back together, but not quite in the way that didn't work, at least for me. Maybe we can put these pieces back together in a different way that does seem to work and be in accord with the insights of modernity and post-modernity. Maybe we can do that, and I think if we do that, there's a kind of play, there's a kind of openness there that will be, yeah, heretical or extreme or something to more orthodox takes, but it is, I think, a particularly kind of metamodern approach to reconstruction. I did just want to say briefly though on the deification part, you know um I'm also there is another reading which is fairly orthodox in the sense that it goes all the way back to Origen of Alexandria, who was a father of the church, or I don't know if he would have that official title, but he was a certainly a major
His status
theologian.
is discussed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But if you read on first principles, I love that text. Like that's a version of Christianity I find very compelling, which um, you could interpret as a deification process in which all humans are kind of working their way through a sort of celestial hierarchy. And it's an intriguing thing to think about the notion of a celestial hierarchy through the lens of complexification. That would be its own conversation. And this is also, I'll note, highly speculative, but it's
Yeah.
where I like to kind of theologically dance a little bit if we're going to go in that direction, because there's something profoundly beautiful and sublime, most, I think, beautifully articulated in Dante, where you get this tiered nature of reality that the human soul rises up. You get it in Bonaventure too, and all these other mystics of rising up through the levels of reality on the soul's journey to God, passing from the human into the angelic on the way
Yeah.
before being subsumed in the divine. And you can see that as a deification process, as a kind of
Mhm.
apotheosis that leads from a kind of differentiated state to a unification with the divine.
Yeah.
And whether or not we understand that in terms of the kinds of evolutionary processes that we're talking about is a very interesting one. But I just wanted to make mention of that.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
And I'm not. I'm not saying this is true, guys, but there are Christian forms of pantheism,
Mm,
and people have argued that Paul's language when he speaks to the Greeks in Acts 17 is very pantheistic, right? And so, if you consider evolution to be true and pantheism to be true and Christianity to be true, then like you'll come out with this like um idea that evolutionary history itself is the unfolding
yeah.
of the divine itself,
Yeah.
the Christian divinity itself throughout time, which is a whole big idea. But I think it's now you have to again you have to do a lot to get there.
Mm.
And I'm not necessarily going there, but that to me that sounds like something you're saying.
Yes. And there's a
And
there that can be gone to. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I should also say, and something that does concern me a bit, is that we've noticed this trend over several, maybe a decade now, where probably more than a decade, where new age teachings and spirituality has been put into the church
Mm,
and given this Christian spin. So you have this law of attraction. You have this kind of
mm,
prosperity gospel thing, which kind of looks like law of attraction and these other new age beliefs.
mhm,
Some hyper charismatic stuff, which I take a lot of issue with. It does some of this, and
mhm.
so a lot of the your articulation of metamodern Christianity. It sounds like New Age Christianity, except a little, maybe a little bit more. I don't know if you've heard that. I don't know if, and I don't
N-
know if you've thought about
Well,
that. But what are your thoughts on that?
my thoughts on that are kind of, maybe they might be surprising because, and I also don't want to hurt anyone's feelings by saying this, but like I do not like new age stuff at all. I
Really?
Yeah, I both aesthetically, sensibility wise, but just conceptually, I find a lot of magical thinking and nonsense in a lot of new age thought. Now it depends on what we mean by new age thought, right? Like as far as I know, the idea of the new age goes back to Jung, and there's some great stuff in Jung, which some of which you were mentioning earlier, and there's also been some great stuff that has emerged in the kind of radically ecumenical, radically multi-traditional religious space, right? I think
Yeah,
trying to be religiously pluralistic, there's a lot to that. There's also just a lot of nonsense there, and there's a lot of easy ways in which you get sort of buffet style religiosity of I'll take a little bit of this, I'll take a little bit of that, not do justice to any of it. But on the whole, yeah, again, I mean, not to hurt any new age folks' feelings out there, but like, no, when I see anything new agey, I think it's cringe. I think it's almost always nonsense, and
that's
I don't
really
necessarily, yeah.
that is really interesting because your idea of explaining God in terms of a divine consciousness that is expanding in some sense, like that's to me, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, maybe you can help me, but that sounds like Christ consciousness, and you even want to take
Mm.
Christ and consider. Perhaps Christ consciousness would actually be a good label for what you're for the consciousness that you're talking about, and so that's kind of how it sounds to me, which is a
No, it's great.
particularly new age phrase, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no,
Yeah.
you're right, and you're picking up on something that's there. Part of that
Mhm.
is part of it's intentional, part of it's just convenience. I do use the phrase Christ consciousness, and that, yeah, I guess you could say comes out of a more new age context. But sometimes what I will do is pick up on themes that have been popular in new age contexts, but I won't necessarily mean them in the full new age sense. I mean, a big one for me is the evolution of consciousness. I mean, I remember growing up hearing that term, and it didn't really mean anything to me at the time. It's since come to mean quite a lot. But that notion or that topic is huge in New Age circles. But usually it takes on this ridiculous flavor, right? Ah, the
Mm.
evolution of consciousness. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you've got to vibrate at a higher frequency, and Krishna consciousness and Buddha consciousness, and da, da, da. It's like this is nonsense.
Yeah,
But if what we mean is a scientifically informed, empirically grounded understanding of the emergence of, yeah, phenomenal consciousness out of non-conscious or at least minimally conscious matter, uh, that when tracking with the developmental psychology literature actually demonstrably is shown to expand in its levels of self-regard, self-identity, moral regard, etc. Then there's a there to that.
Mhm.
Ken Wilber is a thinker in the integral philosophy camp who I think has been very successful in New Age circles. Whether or not you'd identify him as a New Age thinker is debatable, but I think he much more comfortably fits in that category than others. And I love his work. I think he's not, he doesn't, I wouldn't say it all the way he says it, and I have a different take on some of these things. And there's all sorts of ways you could critique his work, but on the whole, he's done some great and important, meaningful things. And so, if that's what we mean by New Age, great. At the same time, again, like people who might gravitate to that New Age version of this story, vibe wise, yeah, it's very postmodern, and it's very not in the
Mm.
cynical sense, actually, kind of in a
Right.
more like the 60s kind of hippie sense.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it kind of critiques the whole modern Western Enlightenment thing and kind of tracks to the east and looks for ancient wisdoms and things. But
Right.
yeah, I would say I'm very, very critical of New Age stuff. But I do sometimes use some of the terms and language from it. And there are some gems in there and some genuine insights that I think there's just not a lot. There's a lot more dross. There's a lot, than there is anything else. There's a
Yeah.
lot of noise and
And
signal.
I think I would agree with you there. I've studied a lot of religious trauma
Mm,
and read a lot of literature on it because and especially as a more conservative uh, Protestant Christian, I am very concerned about like fundamentalism.
mm,
Uh, I'm very concerned about these ways that people are using my religion, which is supposed to save people and make people better,
mm.
hurt people and make them worse,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I've studied a lot of religious drama, and so but one of the things that come out of that is like spiritual bypassing, um, uh, uh, and these other ideas where like and New Age comes
Yeah.
up
Yeah.
because one of two things might happen. Either a New Age person will assign vibrational frequencies that are good or bad to emotions,
Mm.
so now they can't
Yeah.
be themselves holistically because
Yeah.
they have to suppress anger because you don't want to send that vibe out
Right.
to someone else,
Yeah.
right? Which causes a whole lot of psychological problems. And then the other thing that comes up is like spiritual bypassing, where you say, I don't need to get a job and support my family because law of attraction, if I give good things to the universe and speak these things and declare them,
Mhm.
maybe by faith, if you have a Christian flavor to this, then I'm going to receive blessings and good vibrations back, right? And so, like, I read this one case where this woman had to get a divorce because her husband just would not get a job
Huh.
and support, the household and stuff. And um, so hearing your language and being familiar with that space, it kind of rung a bell for me. But like
Mm.
if you have and maybe this speaks to the metamodern, right? Separating the wheat from the chaff. I'm going
Mhm.
to use this language, yes, but I'm also going to take the scientific insight from the modern into my account.
Yeah.
You guys aren't doing that. Or if you are, you're abusing it, right? With this idea of vibrations and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is why naturalism is so important and why the modern insights are so important. And I rub a lot of people the wrong way in my own kind of community spaces, I think, for being too scientifically oriented. As far as I'm comfortable going so far is archetypal in the sense of the psychological and these sorts of things. But when people start moving into the esoteric and they start saying things like, we have 5 fingers on 5 hands because of the five elements and the five, it's like, this is
Yeah.
nonsense.
Yeah.
It's like, and so yeah, for me, I've seen a lot of what you're talking about, religious traditions being used to hurt people unintentionally most of the time. uh
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but still it happens, and I've also experienced that. And I think that the best response to that is the kinds of insights that the modern period gave us, which is, hey, maybe we shouldn't just take things on authority. Maybe we should actually ask critical questions. We should look for evidence. You know, you do get people, obviously, who go way too far with that and just lack imagination and lack the sense of mystery and this sort of thing. I think, the new atheist movement and people like Richard Dawkins just seem almost
Yeah.
temperamentally unable to kind of enter a different space than just, hard
Yeah.
empiricism without even interrogating the metaphysical assumptions behind all that. And so that's very sad. But for me, I will always come back to what's the evidence for this, like uh what are we basing this off of? And a lot of my big bugbear from any spirituality spaces is just a total confusion or lack of regard for causation, and then you get a whole bunch of magical thinking. You get people doing things that don't work, or are just as effective as chance, and then they
Right.
hurt themselves, they hurt other people, and they're just lying to themselves, and that's not helpful for anyone. So for me, I'm
Yeah.
very oriented to this in the way John Vervaeke will talk about wisdom, which is like, how do we get into optimal grip with reality, because that is going to be the site of meaning making and relevance and significance and experiences of growth, transformation, and ultimately awe. And so anyway, I have a million thoughts on that, but yeah, I'm glad I got a chance to clear that up, because from where I'm coming from, a phrase like Christ consciousness can do one thing of value, which is it can help render the idea of Christ in a more abstract way that can allow people to relate to it themselves. But beyond that, I would probably eschew any of the kinds of associations with a term like that you might find in New Age circles.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's pretty good clarification. That might have been something I would have asked, in class. In classes, that class was a phenomenal space. And so I have no hate towards that, but obviously there's a lot of people there, right? It's not just us. Um, yeah, very interesting stuff. So are there and this is one of the things I was thinking about. Um, your qualifier, right? Genuine knowledge, like taking
Mm,
the insights from the genuine knowledge. Um, we've talked a lot about this modern frame and maybe even some of the weaknesses of this modern frame have taken too far, like a Richard Dawkins who just doesn't seem to have any imagination or doesn't question the assumptions behind a imperialistic uh imperialistic frame of thinking. Um how might the insights of postmodernism
yeah.
help you there? And so I'm kind of curious because what I hear a lot of with regards to postmodernism are things surrounding like race and gender.
Yeah.
Like one of the things we talked about in the last live stream with Kevin was that one of the interesting things that happened with the emergent church was that they adopted a postmodern framework to do theology,
Mm.
Bible ministry, but it was still all kind of like white male stuff,
Uh-huh.
which was really weird because a postmodern framework wants to deconstruct these hierarchies and
Yeah.
make you think about your maleness and your whiteness as such.
Yeah.
And so I guess talk to us again about like what you've adopted from postmodernism in general, and then I would be particularly curious as like, a black male, whatever that means, um, how you how might race and gender play into metamodern
Yeah.
Christianity?
Yeah. Good questions.
Yeah.
I think, all right. So there's an initial move there that's really helpful, and it has to do with even just seeing that there is a question there, right?
Hmm.
What are we not conscious of that is actually influencing our understanding of reality? Like, to pose that question and to start to interrogate some of the things we take for granted or are keeping outside of our conscious awareness. That is a really good legacy of postmodern critical thought, right? And so you mentioned, yes, there is this emphasis in postmodernism to draw attention to things like race and gender and the construction of these things, and those are important moves. Now, a metamodern take on this, I can say pretty generally, I think, because I think this is often found across the board, not always, but is that there's an insight there, but that doesn't mean that the way that this plays out and the directions that this gets taken in postmodernism are the best ones. And in fact, I would say most of the time they're not. They get really abused. They get misunderstood. People don't really get what is genuinely of value in making these kinds of moves. Um, so what often happens is that, maybe I'll come back to that. So the basic value of a postmodern move is to say, hey, yeah, okay, look, we got all these scientists saying things about medicine and trying to make the world better and give us progress on all these things. Okay, great. Hey, wait a second though, like, they're talking about universal truth and universal reason, but like, are they actually, like, are these things that they're saying actually universal? And are there ways in which the perspective that they're bringing to this is coloring their own understanding of reality in a way that's actually not there? Like what are people bringing to things that isn't actually part of the picture? And so I guess what I would say is there are different ways of understanding the emphasis of social construction. Um, some of them can be so the basic idea of social construction, right, is to recognize that things that we took for granted about our social experience are actually constructions.
Hmm.
They actually emerge out of history. They emerge out of cultural contexts, and that therefore, at the very least, we shouldn't take them as inherent or natural in some kind of fundamental way, right? And that actually that there's a deep contingency built into how we interpret certain things. um and I think that that's a genuine insight, and so focusing on the recognition of the reality of social construction is a vital move. Now, what do we do with that? What are the implications of it? This is where postmodernism mostly goes awry. One of the ways it does that is that it confuses the notion of something being constructed with it being false, which is not
Mm,
the case, right?
interesting.
A
Yeah.
car is a social construct, right? Without society,
Right.
cars don't exist. That doesn't mean a car isn't going to hit you if you jump in front of it, right? And so similarly, other things that we experience in the social world might be social constructs, but they might be real social constructs,
Mm.
So there's that. Or even another example, mathematics, right? Mathematics is a social construct. Before human beings, there was no mathematics, okay? But is mathematics, despite it being socially constructed, still orienting us to something actually fundamental in the nature of universal reality?
Quick question there.
Yeah.
Is this like a postmodern deconstruction of the concept of mathematics, where we're getting people who will say that 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, or am I tripping on that, or is this completely unrelated?
No, it's related. I mean, I don't know who would say that and kind of hold to it, but I'm not. I wouldn't be surprised. Nothing will surprise me anymore if people.
I I've
Yeah,
seen some things on the internet.
yeah. But
um,
no, really. I mean, so well, maybe it's related to this. I'm not sure what you've seen, but yes, you'll find people who will say things like mathematics is there isn't. It's not like we discovered anything. It's just we created a bunch of symbols and there's some internal consistency to it. I find that a very silly, misguided way of understanding something. But it does point to this confusion that people have of once you identify that something's a social construct, that doesn't mean that you can just toss it out. And so I think that what we make of this insight is really important because we can also see how some things are social constructs that maybe aren't particularly well grounded and maybe they are mostly contingent and actually, for example, back in the pre-modern period, people thought kingship was this is how things are supposed to be governed, right? Like if you do
right.
something different, you're breaking with the natural order. Now, actually, a postmodern analysis there is helpful because it shows, okay, no, it's a social construct, and two, what are the power dynamics that would create incentives for that story to be told, right? Because if you can show that and you can kind of deconstruct kingship then and say that, hey, isn't it really helpful and advantageous for kings and monarchs and rich people to make everyone else think that this is the way it has to be? There's a case that then you're actually allowing people to say, hey, wait, things can be different. And then maybe you can get a more equal, egalitarian society, more equal, more egalitarian at least. And I think that the modern legacy is kind of a sign of that way of thinking of like, hey, actually things are up for grabs a little bit more than we thought. Um, so anyway, social construction is a really powerful thing, but I think that the postmodern legacy has foregrounded it and then sort of made all sorts of false conclusions based on it that has gotten us to a lot of silly places where we're at now. Um, and uh, you know, there are varying degrees of all of this, and I think the way that now people talk about race and gender as being social constructs, it's like on the one hand, yes, but then we want to ask a question of like, well, how are they social constructs? Are they social constructs in the same way that like kingship being the only and natural form of government was a social construct, or are they more like social constructs the way mathematics is a social construct? I don't think it's like either of them. I think it's somewhere in between and a mixture of aspects of both and all this stuff, right? But we can at least begin to ask those kinds of questions. So Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I would say very briefly, just on the postmodern front. There's a lot more
Mhm.
that could be said, but yeah,
So it sounds like there's more critique of a postmodern than there is appraisal, but there's more appraisal of a modern than there is like critique, right? And so you have aspects of both, right? There's
yeah,
like overlap and stuff, but it does seem it. I get the sense at least that it's uneven in your articulation of things, and so am I accurate in that? And then I guess not that is that a bad thing, but could there be more balance?
yeah. No, it's a good question. I think it's a little bit person specific. I probably skew that way, but it's also highly context specific. Meaning, depending on who I'm talking to, I will foreground different aspects of this in different ways.
Okay.
So, for and this gets to things like the zone of proximal development, right? Where if I'm trying to make a case about metamodernism, but I'm in a context that maybe skews much more towards like a kind of more fundamental pre-modern, as I would read it, kind of religiosity.
Mhm.
Maybe the thing I'll lean into is the modern aspect of things to integrate, because that's going to be the next thing to happen, right, for someone if they're kind of moving through the sequence, because you can't really do the postmodern thing fully until you've done the modern thing fully, would be the
Right.
argument. And and it's also the sort of thing that, like, for me, and this used to drive my parents crazy, but like, because they would call me a devil's advocate. But for me, it's not about whether or not we agree on something. It's about why we agree on something. And that's more important. And so if there's a point to be made, even if I agree with someone about something, like let's say I'm talking to someone and they say, spirituality, religion, and myth are super important, and we need to see more of that in contemporary society because our current situation is, experiencing a meaning crisis and all this stuff. I would say yes, that's great. But then if what they mean by that is that's why we need to get rid of all this modern and postmodern hogwash and go back to good old fashioned religion, I would say, oh no. And so then I would be I would be specifically trying to target the issues related to modernity and postmodernity that are of value that that person could see. Now, conversely, if I'm talking to someone who's full on modernist mode and all they see, like, God bless him, but like I had a podcast conversation with Stephen Hicks. Okay. Um, People may know him because he has a course on the Peterson Academy, and he's sort of a philosopher
Oh,
and
okay.
all this stuff.
Gotcha.
And he's a super bright guy. He wrote a book on postmodernism, but he's a full-on modernist. Like, he's just Enlightenment, Ayn Rand style objectivism, all this stuff. And again, whatever, that's fine. But in a conversation with him, I'm going to want him to lean into the positive aspects of postmodernism. And so I'm going to
Mm,
bring that stuff up, because I'm going to be like, well, wait a second. Look at the problems that industrialization introduced, and looked at this and that, right? I'm going to want to push that postmodern move for him and show, yeah, maybe there is something, because what really is important is that we see some value in all of these, but we also see some problems in all of these. And as you
yeah.
say, it's about the wheat and the chaff. So yeah, context specific, person specific. And where I land on this, I don't know. I probably am somewhat imbalanced. I don't even necessarily know how, but probably I skew maybe with deeper sympathies towards the modern and less towards the postmodern and the pre-modern.
Mhm.
I'd be up to hear that critique.
Interesting. And so, one of the comments that I actually I got two comments related to this that I got in one of my videos talking about this subject was that um, there is a lot, and I think like you're well read. You could probably I would agree. You would probably agree with this to some extent that sometimes in in academic spaces and in spaces there are a lot of like abstract up here philosophical drivel,
Yeah,
right? And then
yeah,
you're like, you get to the end of the conversation, you're like, I don't care.
yeah,
None
yeah,
of this mattered to me.
yeah,
Why is this relevant?
yeah,
So maybe, and so I let me do like a hypothetical, like a on the ground example, maybe,
yeah,
and then you can kind of like let me know what you think about this as you've read this stuff. So you let's say a modern person says in this hypothetical says this person here is beautiful, objectively beautiful, right? The postmodern person might say, well, first off, we need to question the idea of objective beauty. Secondly, one of the reasons why we need to question it is because we're creating standards of beauty that are marginalizing groups of people. That's a huge problem. And those marginalizations are causing oppression and these other things.
Mm,
And then the meta modern person might want to say, well, we could take that into account, but there's still something that's objective about the beauty of this person. But maybe our standard of objective beauty needs to expand
mm,
beyond just what this narrow view here that allowed for the marginalization.
mm.
Would that be a fair shake?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that
Mm.
I would find yes, both of the modern and the postmodern views there incomplete. Um, uh,
Right. There's
because
always
if
more that can be said.
yeah,
Yeah.
if someone says they are objectively beautiful, my first thought will be that postmodern critique. Well, wait a second, what do you mean by in that, right? So my
Hmm.
mind will go there. But then if I were to hear that postmodern person give that response to that modern person, my first thought would then be this whole other line of thinking, which goes something like, well, okay, yes, but even though there's a socially constructed nature to what is being perceived as beauty, that doesn't mean that it is divorced from reality. And in fact, what we have to see here is that, again, speaking of philosophical neologisms, which are in danger of being just highfalutin concepts, but actually I think in this case can do a lot of work. Maybe there's a transjective way in which that person is experiencing beauty, because they are a subject and they're experiencing an object and they're experiencing the sense of beauty between them. So it's a relationship that's going on there. And
Mm.
so that realness of that is actually not in the object. It's actually in the subject object relationship that is
Oh,
itself has to be understood in the whole kind of evolutionary context of, how do
interesting.
humans come to see beauty? And it has to be conceived in terms of like, biology and
Yeah.
reproduction and this sort of thing, all that stuff. But like that would be a good example where like this is partly why the postmodern view is ridiculous, because it just sees the social construction and it sees it as potentially marginalizing of some people, and it just wants to undo the marginalization. So then it's just going to say what, right? Oh, well, we should make a world in which everyone is beautiful. Well, that's nonsense. Like that's not how the world
I
works.
also find it hard to live by. Like, I get guilty sometimes when not thinking certain people are beautiful because I have that cynical
Mm.
voice in the back of my head. But I'm also sitting here like, I don't know how else to. I don't know how else to think of
Well, right.
of these people. That doesn't mean they're bad. That doesn't mean we should treat them badly. It
That's
just
right.
it
That's
just
right.
it's just my internal thinking about your appearance, which you don't even have to care about. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, but like here's the thing
Yeah.
is like we should do some meaningful philosophical interrogation of all that and get to understand why the postmodern answer is insufficient, because we intuitively get it,
Mhm.
but it's like, well, why? Okay, well, I can tell you why. It's like, okay, what does this even mean, beauty? Like I say something is beautiful, right? So there's an aesthetic registration process that's going on here. All that registers as beauty. Where does that even come from? Well, I have to look to a couple layers going on here. One is the social layer in terms of the social world that I live in and the kinds of ideas and justifications that show up there. But there's also a biological like mammalian layer that I can't just ignore. Like I am an
Right.
animal. I'm a person, yes, but I'm also an animal, and animals do select their sexual mates based on the registering of sexual attraction, which is basically, if you're talking about people being attractive or beautiful, that's kind of what is the kind of coloration there.
Mhm.
Is that that's going to be inflected through a biological evolutionary history, and to ignore that is as silly as to ignore the fact that that there's a wall here that I think I can just walk through, and this is
Right.
where so much postmodern thought just goes wrong. It wants to just deny reality because it thinks everything's language, and if we can just change the words we use for things, we can change reality. So its whole metaphysics is wrong in that sense. It misunderstands social construction. But rather, what we could say is, okay, maybe there's a whole biological substrate that this whole beauty analysis thing is operating on, but it's also mediated through a social layer, and that's going to have social contextual aspects that are also need to be taken into account, right? What's the media I get bombarded with and and consume all the
Yeah.
time? What are the
Right.
advertisements, right? What are the images of beauty that my culture values? Now, those are social constructions layered on top of these biological, relationships, and those themselves are more malleable, you could say. But even those have some relationship to reality. Like we can't just imagine that things are just totally arbitrary in the social world and just get invented willy nilly, right? Like,
Mhm.
why do some things become popular at certain times and not others? Like, there's still a deeper sense of a logic going on even in the social world. But still, you could still say, all right, well, maybe I've been particularly programmed by my society and its expectations according to a certain beauty standard, and maybe that's problematic. So let me interrogate that, and maybe you can interrogate that. Maybe you can make effort to like try to deprogram your mind and all that. But to some degree, like we have to grapple with like what is the uh the space outside of social construction that social construction is mapping, and we can't ignore that. And so much of the failure of postmodernism has been based on misreading
Yeah.
that understanding.
That's fair, and I think that's helpful to make things more concrete and to see how a person through these different periods might do something, and how a metamodern person, and by contrast, might take in both and then push farther, which sounds like what you did in your response, which I find interesting.
Well,
Uh,
and real quick, there's also the insight there that, right, that like if historically postmodernists have been supposed to identify moves made by people to use power to sort of prop up a reality, that's exactly what a postmodern person would be trying to do in that context, right? Of like, people feel X, but we need to enforce a new Y, and so we are
mm,
going to change something and impose on them, right? But of course
and
a
so
postmodern
there's
person, they don't see that. They're playing the same game, but they think that
interesting.
they're doing it for ethically justified reasons, and so they wind up converting everything into a power analysis, where ironically sometimes things aren't even a power analysis situation,
Yeah.
but they make it one, and then they break something, and it's like, so yeah, I do have a deep criticism of it there. Anyway, I'm
And
sorry, I keep
and
interrupting.
there and there, it maybe speaks to a strength of the metamodern, that it can do that reflective work,
Yeah,
whereas postmodernism and modernism isn't doing that. It's
well,
just
that's it.
responding.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that's the whole thing, is
gotcha.
that there's a big blind spot in postmodernism, that because postmoderns are mostly reflecting on modernity and other things, they don't see what they are doing and what presuppositions are already baked into all of their own critique. And so one of the
Mhm.
things that the metamodern does is trying to reflect on the postmodern and say, wait a second, can't you see that you are doing this in the same way that you're accusing of the moderns of doing this in the same way, so like there's a pattern to what people are blocking out. So why don't you just reduplicate that on yourself, postmoderns, and then you'd be able to see yourself from a higher vantage, and that would be a metamodern vantage. So it's
Gotcha.
radicalizing the postmodern move, and basically showing failures in the postmodern approach to something.
Gotcha. So we've talked a lot.
Yeah. It's been
There's
great though. I really
definitely
enjoyed it.
no, yeah, and same here. I have two last
Sure.
questions. So my professor said in this class, you can be at a certain point if you want to. This class is a journey, and he used the analogy of pole vaulting.
Mhm.
He said, for some of you, knowing that there is a sport called pole vaulting in which people do is good enough for you. Others of you are going to wonder why pole vaulting even exists and if anything matters at all. Some of you are going to try to pole vault. Uh, all of those steps are okay in this class, in this space, right? I am weird because I like to throw myself at anything I do that I
Nice.
find particularly interesting.
Good. I like
I'm
that.
interested in pole vaulting, but I don't think I could come to the same conclusions as you, because I mean, for a lot of reasons that I can't recollect at the exact moment, other than um, you know, my experience of Christianity being true, um is significant for me, right? There's
Mhm.
other things too, but personal testimony is evidence. Like
Mhm. Mhm.
evidence is in anything that raises the prior probability of something to me, and I can't deny my own reality, right? All that said, um, I'm interested in doing a like lowercase o orthodox metamodern
Mhm.
Christianity where we can be embedded into the culture, adopt these certain things,
Mhm.
so the gospel and Christianity can like be relevant for all people in all time, because I think it should be.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, eh, but is orthodox, right?
Mhm.
Is saying these things that are important to the tradition are still important. Maybe you'll say dogma or something like that. That doesn't mean you don't consider the postmodern critique of them. I actually typed in the chat GBT, give me like a metamodern doctrine of the Trinity.
Mm.
And so that was interesting. But one of the things it said was that it has to take into account like the postmodern critique of hierarchical structures. And
Mm.
so the Trinity can't be a hierarchy,
Mm.
which I thought was interesting. But so I'm interested in doing something like that, where
Yeah.
the gospel, the resurrection, all these things are maintained to be true, but we take into account some of the metamodern frame, right?
Mhm.
And so I just want to say, firstly, is there anyone who's doing that, and do you think that could be done?
Mm.
Is what I'm kind of getting at.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. Yeah, so I do think there's all sorts of ways this can be done, and I never want to give the impression that I've got the way. And I hope I stressed that earlier.
Hmm.
And I do think that there's some version of what you're talking about that for me I could hear, and even if I disagree with it, I would still be like, yeah, but that still strikes me as in playing in this sandbox.
Right.
Um, and there's a so then it's sort of what that looks like. I mean, I do admit one of the first things that always comes up for me whenever I hear the word orthodoxy, and I know intuitively what you mean, but I think it's important to like do this move, which is like
Right.
whose orthodoxy, what orthodoxy, right? Because
And that's totally. I don't mean to interrupt. That is totally fair.
uh
Like the Roman Catholic does mean something different by
right,
Orthodox. So like,
right,
what do you mean? Who decides?
yeah,
And that's gonna also get into like a postmodern deconstruction of
yeah,
authority, and like
yeah.
what authority do you have to tell me what's Orthodox? All that fair. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, and not just what authority do you have, but like I think it does change the very nature of the question, right? Because I think a lot of people who ask that question, I don't think you're asking it this way, but a lot of times I get a version of that question which hasn't even considered that notion. Like in the same way that, again, like the modernist is going to assume something about universal reality when in fact this is just a bias of their own perspective, right? Or
Hmm.
right, it's sort of like people have the presumption that okay, well, I know that my orthodoxy is true, so how do I do this and blend it with this metamodern thing? And it's like, well, if you're already making that first move, that's the first place you got to start because you got to question what that means. So I don't think that's where you're coming from, but I think that that is important. So I think if you could maybe I think for you maybe the question would be like, or you could maybe specify the question a little bit more in terms of like, here's what I mean by orthodoxy and in the tradition that I mean it in, and I want to do a metamodern approach to this
Hmm.
as that, but maintaining that. So that kind of also narrows things a bit and makes things a little bit clearer for like.
Yeah.
And but all that said, I mean, I think I can intuit that like what you mean, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but something like a bodily resurrection of Jesus, some notion of the inspiration, divine inspiration of the scriptures, some notion of uh, afterlife and heaven, let's just say, and
Hmm.
that the message of Jesus and Jesus's saving ministry on earth as being necessary, sort of things one must assent to in a certain way for that, you know,
Right.
movement to occur, all that stuff. So some form of orthodoxy like that, I would say. Briefly to your second question, are there people already doing that sort of thing? Yeah, I mentioned Paul Anleitner earlier. Um, I think he's really focusing a lot on the the cultural aspect of this metamodern thing, and he and I have some differences about what it might fully mean to do a kind of full metamodern move. But I would definitely recommend him for someone operating with metamodernism as a paradigm, and then trying to engage Christianity, a more orthodox Christianity.
Is he
Than,
Orthodox or Orthodox? Is he Christian?
he's Christian, and I think he would assent to all those things that I said earlier. About believing in a bodily resurrection and this and that. I'm not sure exactly of his theology, but he operates from a much more conservative theology, a more
Interesting.
norm, yeah,
Gotcha.
more kind of orthodox theology. So he's someone who I would gesture to, and then what else would I say? I don't know. I'd be curious. I'd like to see what else people might do with this. Here's the other thing I'd say is like, I think this is a great place to start. This is James
Yeah.
Fowler's work, Stages of Faith, um,
Hmm.
and he was a Christian and a pastor, I think. Even I could be wrong about that, but
I
he
got you.
okay. He um, basically spent his whole career talking about how faith develops, and that there are these different modes to faith, and that different stages, different developmental versions of it. And so I think someone operating from a more orthodox Christianity reading Fowler's work wouldn't find too much offensive in there. There might be some things that they could quibble with, but it isn't particularly radical. But it's very it articulates a developmental approach to religion and to Christianity that I would situate as being a great segue into developmental framings of metamodernism and religion. Um, yeah, that's probably the best I could do for now. There isn't enough I can really go off of to think about
Yeah.
what else this could look like. So I really I mean, all I'll say is that there is an implicit uh, danger in people trying to do the move you're describing, and I just want to name it so that there's sort of a test that for me to kind of be like, yes, this passed the test, that goes into this, which is that again, and I can relate very much to this, but like as a more orthodox, more conservative, uh, theologically conservative person, encountering modernity and its critiques, a lot of which we talked about, and postmodernity and its critiques, there's a strong inclination a lot of the time to see that stuff and be like, ooh, no, I don't like that. That's wrong. Look at all the problems it creates. I'm going to, speaking of bypassing, I'm going to bypass that. I'm just going to move past that, or I'm just not going to engage it. And people can find in metamodernism an excuse to do that because they will say, well, look, there's something valuable in all perspectives. And so that means that there's something valuable here. And so I'm going to throw myself into that. And not only that, they can actually say, well, we can integrate the insight of postmodernism and get beyond it by recognizing, as postmodernism did, that everyone comes from a perspective and everyone comes from a tradition. And so, who's to say, well, in the metamodern move, we're just going to own our particular perspective and just say, hey, I'm going to be a theologically conservative Christian, and there it is, and now I'm a metamodern Christian, and I'm critical of that approach. I think it doesn't fully actually grapple particularly with the modern lens, and that's why I've spent so much time making videos that harp on that aspect of the modern critical approach, because for me, some integration of that kind of material should occur, and so that would be the danger of people saying, yeah, metamodern Christianity, which really ultimately just means, yeah, the same old kind of basically traditionalist Christianity, but postmodernism, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's totally understandable, and I'd be interested. I'm gonna test this out a little bit. Actually, I have a preaching and teaching class, and we have to give a sermon from the Old Testament, and the New Testament. I asked, and I'm not like stealing from it, but I'm getting some ideas from it. But I asked Chat GPT to like write me a sermon based on First Corinthians 15, like that death and resurrection kind of stuff
Mm.
of Jesus and then of the believer, through a meta modern lens. And so some of that was interesting. It mentioned like the oscillation. It mentioned a little bit of doubt and like mystery, and say, hey, embrace the fact that you don't know how exactly this is going to pan
Mm.
out, and some of those things. And so I thought some of those elements were interesting. It mentioned like telling stories, and how you can uh, sort of using the postmodern thing of not focusing on the meta narrative, but looking at your own narrative, maybe how you've experienced a kind of the resurrected Jesus, right,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
or something like that, which would be interesting. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, and I will say something does occur to me that, if someone could have let's say have engaged with all that modern stuff and all this postmodern stuff. And if they've engaged with it and they have a response, they're like, well, at every point where you could say, well, maybe Moses didn't write this or whatever. There, well, actually, if you really look at it, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a way in which people can come to different conclusions, but still be engaging with evidence and these different kinds of
Right.
intellectual heritages. So, if someone at the end of engaging with all that material could have a kind of depth of relationship with it and yet still come to different conclusions, I'm very open to that. That wasn't my experience, but people draw different kinds of conclusions on evidence. And so I think for me, the biggest hangup that we always have to be wary of is that it's very easy to engage in motivated reasoning, right? And so
Yeah.
I just know this from my own
Mhm.
experience that I did it a lot. It's sort of like I know that my faith is the right thing. So if I encounter something as I conceive of my faith presently that contradicts it or poses a problem to it, I have to reject that. I have to say that is wrong. And someone was telling me about the difference between what's called soldier mindset versus scout mindset, which I think kind of gets at this, which
Mm.
is the soldier mindset. They're there to defend. They're there to attack when things attack you, and to kind of hold the ground, right? But a
Mm.
scout mindset is they're going to go explore. They're curious. They want to learn things. And I think that that's really important for the metamodern approach to things. It is about learning, and it's about growing. It's being open to change, being open to have your mind
Mm.
changed, and being open to transformation, not for its own sake, but because it will improve your life and it will improve the lives of those around you, and it will deepen your connection to reality, which is wisdom and it's truth. And so I would say that, yeah, if we can avoid the soldier mindset as much as possible, we can come to different conclusions, but as long as we're doing it, as much as we can from an unmotivated reasoning standpoint, then yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I actually think that'd be a great way to put things to an end, at least for now. We could always honestly we could always do a part two. I'd be very interested. There's always more to talk about. Always more questions. Your stuff with Metamodern and spirituality is really interesting. It was kind of funny because I remember watching, like listening as I was doing housekeeping at a relatively conservative Christian university. Um, I was listening to your first episode of Metamodern Christianity, and I was getting there. I was like, okay, I'm jiving, I'm moving and grooving, and then you said, "Bam, documentary hypothesis," and then you said some other stuff, and I said,
Yeah.
"Oh, I have hit a wall now."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but I'd be interested to see if I could pole vault over that wall, as it
Yeah.
were.
And again, also,
Yeah,
like, not everyone, like it's not so much about the kinds of conclusions one draws as much as the genuine process of genuine inquiry that I think is the
yeah.
important thing. So it's much more about method and process than about outcome per se. But the other thing,
Okay.
I also just one last thing I'll say on my front, because and then we can close this out, which has been a
Mhm.
great conversation, is just to say, kind of back to that pole vaulting bit, like I don't think anyone should feel like they need to rush this stuff.
Yeah.
Like like for me, um, I remember going into my undergraduate years and starting that out, and I was still very theologically conservative. And here I'm in these religion classes, and I'm doing the study of religion, and we're getting into definitions of religion and anthropology and stuff. And I just there's so much about my early education that I was so resentful of and really annoyed by, because it just struck me as, oh, these are all just a bunch of, yeah, kind of brainwashed, liberal, secular, atheistic people who dot dot dot. And I was very close to it, and there was nothing that could have made it different. And even if, and especially if someone expected me to be different, it would have made it worse. So I
Mm.
don't want anyone to take away from this like, here's where you should be, or here's where you're supposed to be soon, or something like that. Like, this is purely, I think, an attempt to explain some patterns from a lot of people as they've moved through life, and feel like, hey, maybe there's a certain kind of way that people tend to move if they spend a lot of time and passionate inquiry in this space. Um, and so I won't say I don't think it's not better, or that it's not normative, because I do think that there are better and more true, all that stuff. But like, So I'm not trying to make a relativistic claim, but I think that it would be really harmful and just also wrong for people to like take this as like this is what I'm supposed to do, so I guess I'll do it. It's like it's kind of like
Yeah.
poetry. I don't know. It was just this quote came up recently. Poetry should come like leaves to the trees or not at all, which is like what Keats said. It's
Mm,
kind of like this. It's like this should be something that unfolds organically for people or not at all. And so
mm,
if people find themselves over the course of their faith journey going through critical periods and then maybe deconstructive periods and then reconstructive periods, maybe maps like these will be really helpful. And maybe this will, speak to many people where they're at in their faith journeys. But that's about it. And I think that that's what people should read it as. And if you try to make it more than that, and you try to, yeah, it's just it's that's not, yeah, it's important to understand what this kind of thing is and what it's trying to communicate. And I've been
yeah.
really impressed by you and the whole class, and for engaging these topics in this way. But I also don't expect, like I don't, yeah, there's no expectation that this is going to like click necessarily for people. And if
Yeah.
anything, I would expect it not to. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And we talk about metamodernism as a framework, just like postmodernism as a framework, but like it's also a culture. And
sure.
at least if you're going to be or I mean you don't have to do this at all, but also if you're the type to do apologetics from a particular frame, then at least considering what's happening in the culture
Yeah,
and separating that wheat from the chaff, and then
yeah,
whatever you feel you need to do apologetically, at least that in and of itself could be of value. So uh, but yeah, thank you to everyone who joined me for this. Thank you so much, Brendan,
yeah,
for
man.
doing this. This was a lot longer than I thought it'd be, but it's been awesome.
Me too. But
I've
yeah, it
done
was
long
great.
streams, so that's totally okay. Again, thank you to everyone watching. Check out Brendan's work. I will put the links down in the description if I have not. Timestamps will also be here as well, so you can jump around the video. Timestamps are in the previous video about postmodernism as well, if you want to check that out. Again, as like a primer for this, because I think it only makes sense given the subject matter and the historical happenstance of all this to talk about postmodernism first and the
Mm.
thing about postmodern Christianity first. So again, thank you so much for viewing this. Thank you so much, Brendan. And I'm really glad to have been able to bring like a snapshot of my class, like to my content and to the broader internet space, and see what happens. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Well, I just want to say, while I can, thank you. This was really great. Ask great questions, and I think what you're doing here is good stuff. And so, mad respect and much appreciated. Really enjoyed this, And again, yeah, there's even more we could talk about. But I appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to this and the knowledge that you're bringing to it, and just your curiosity. I mean, it means a lot. So I really feel very honored and appreciative, and think you're doing great work. So thank you. It's yeah, good stuff.